Chapter 16. As they parted, Leander spoke.
Yes, Your Highness.
His hand was around Anova's waist, pulling her to him even as they faced the most powerful Fae here. Anova felt like she couldn't breathe. Was this really the Fae who had orchestrated the deaths of Leander's entire family? He seemed too unstable to have done such a thing. The High King smiled, and sharp teeth showed through his thin lips.
How good to see you at one of the moon celebrations, young Wolfsbane.
Anova thought she saw a strange gleam pass in and out of his eyes.
You've been absent for too long.
She didn't dare move, but his eyes found hers anyway.
Perhaps this is your reason?
They were both too still. Leander broke the short silence.
Even a king has his courtesans, though I am not near to the station of a king.
Her heart hammered in her chest. She remembered her first night in Fae again. The Fae lady's screams echoed in her ears.
Of course.
The High King's eyes were on her, and they overwhelmed her. She felt like she was gazing into the slitted eyes of a snake. His lilting voice lowered and evened out.
Their kind is so different from ours. So interesting.
His eyes flashed back to Leander's face.
I couldn't have guessed your tastes were thus, though I admit it does not surprise.
Abruptly, Anova remembered that this was her strongest lead in her pursuit to find her mother's murderer. There was a high chance that the Fae before her killed her mother with his own hands or had ordered her death. And likely because he'd fathered a child with her. Heat prickled at the back of her neck. Without warning, the High King looked at her. I know little of the magic the blood crown lends him. What if? But even in her mind, she couldn't think it. He was still staring at her. Her blood pressure dropped like a stone in a river, and she felt like she was going to slide to the floor. Leander was saying something, and it was moments later before either she or the High King took notice.
If you would prefer, I would give you my gift now.
He'd brought an offering. Pinched between his thumb and finger was a thin stem. On the end of it was a procession of freshly opened orchid flowers that were a dazzling mixture of purple and blue that she'd never seen before. The High King's grin widened at the sight.
A lovingly tended pick, from your own garden, no less.
He nodded to one of his guards. The Fae guard promptly took it from Leander and examined it for what she didn't know. It wasn't a poisonous flower, she knew. Just a pretty one.
And
The High King interrupted himself as his eyebrows came together and his head tilted. To her, he asked,
Just what is your name, human?
Anova forced her mouth open. She didn't have an alternate name prepared, and she felt in her bones that it was wrong to give such a Fae access to even that part of her. But as she looked into his snake-like gaze, her name slipped from her tongue. Anova.
Anova,
the High King repeated, as if the word were a piece of fruit he was savoring.
Anova,
he said again.
What is it that you have to offer me under this quarter moon?
Her pulse raced. Fae bastard. Why didn't you warn me about this part of your plan? Her hands would have gone to her pockets, but she didn't have any. She didn't have anything on her except the clothes on her back and the necklace around her throat. Somehow she didn't think the former was practical for her sanity or that the latter would please him. An idea struck. Anova was so close to Leander that all she had to do was move her hand out and unpin it from his lapel. Leander didn't move. She held her palm to the High King for his inspection. The spider pin glittered in her hand.
Something stolen from a lover.
His grin was wider than she'd ever seen it.
Delicious.
This time, he grabbed the offered gift before his guard could move. His guards seemed disapproving, but the High King could only stare at the small metal spider. "Yes, this will do," he said, bringing his gaze back to them at last. His eyes were black in the shadows. They gleamed like a dark rainbow. "I hope you enjoy the fate, Leander Wolfsbane and Anova." When they left the High King and his crowd of guards, Anova felt as if she could finally breathe. And then she remembered something. She spun on her aching feet to face Leander. "You didn't tell me about that part." Leander had the decency to look embarrassed. Or that's what she assumed he was feeling anyway. His lips pressed tight together, and he looked elsewhere. "An oversight," he said merely. She moved so that he couldn't avoid her face. "Next time I need to know everything, Fae." Something tugged inside her chest. "I'm not merely your servant. You'll find I'm far more useful that way." Leander bared his teeth at her. "Keep your voice down." Anova didn't care. All she knew was that she'd seen too many Fae that night. She shoved past him and he didn't follow. She knew she was being exceedingly foolish, but she couldn't bring herself to care. She felt too vulnerable here, too human. Her eyes stung and she was fairly sure her feet had started bleeding again. Her stomach muscles pulled at nothing. She couldn't remember when she'd last eaten, but food was not something she trusted here. She moved to the fate banquet tables anyway, like a bee to nectar. Hunger scraped the bottom of her belly when she saw it all. Plump fruits, cheese wedges, and beds of greenery stretched to either end. Resting in the middle of it all was a roasted duck, glistening in a citrus marinade that she could smell from a distance. Plates of roasted and herbed fish sat around it in a semicircle. The salmon was still warm by some magic. As Anova stared, a thought occurred to her. Why is the Fae High King taxing Urbess so heavily? They aren't suffering here. She stopped herself and considered the Fae that were dancing their lives away too close to her. Well, at least for crown pieces. Hunger drowned out the rest of her curiosity. She grabbed as much as she could hold in her hands and mouth, then replaced it all as they scraped down her throat. Unshed tears brimmed her eyelids. It was too delicious. As soon as she fulfilled her hunger, she realized her thirst. She started to reach for a pitcher she prayed was water and nothing else when she saw it. It must have been kicked under the table by a careless Fae and dropped by its owner before that. She didn't need the object, but it reminded her too much of her home to not inspect it, at least. Anova dove under the banquet table and pulled out the flask. It was the sort of flask that men carried in the interior of their coat pockets, usually filled with mead, ale, or wine. Holding it before her face, she inspected it and grinned. So, there was one thing we have that the Fae don't have. She unscrewed the container and sniffed it. A second later, she downed what little remained inside. The taste of mulberries prickled the back of her throat. Human wine. It tasted like home, too. Anova looked about her. She didn't know where Leander had gone. None of the Fae were paying her any attention now that Wolfsbane wasn't on her arm. One of us sticks out like the rotten apple in a bushel, and it's not me. She was about to put the flask back where she'd found it when she considered something. She needed a weapon. Quickly, before she could decide against it, she dipped the throat of the flask in the goblet of moonlight nectar, tapping the side of the glass to remove the excess liquid clinging to it. Anova screwed the cap on again and shoved it inside the bodice of her dress. There hadn't been much room there to begin with. Breathing was beginning to hurt. Anova glanced up to check that the guards still weren't watching her when she saw the reason for their distraction. They weren't watching her, or anyone. Many of them had gathered into a circle. Around someone. Not Leander. Not Leander. She edged closer, sticking to the walls. Most all the other Fae were still moon-mad and dancing their brains out. A blessing. But the closer she got, the more she saw it wasn't Leander. Just as she was about to turn away and find the Fae bastard despite herself, she heard their voices.
"What are these? Explain yourself."
It was one of the guards. On the other side of his spear blade was a young Fae. She was smaller than most other Fae she'd seen, and flowers were woven throughout her hair. The Fae was wearing a dress that looked like it was made of dewdrops and spun silk. Her hair was newly loosed around her face. Even from a distance, Anova could tell from the waves in her hair that it had been pinned up about her head moments before. Her voice was quiet but steady. "They're hair accessories." Anova shoved past a creature that was crawling on the ground before her. The sound of the slap was barely audible over the chaos, but Anova heard it.
"And you expect us to believe that?"
In the guard's hand, he held up 2 hairpins. On one side were flowers formed from gold and pearls. On the other were tongue-like metal points that formed the pin. Even though they were clearly hairpins, they were sharp. "They were my mother's." The Fae's words were muffled, and Anova's view was obstructed by a Fae passing in front of her. She stood on her toes to try to catch sight of the young Fae again when she realized who it was that she was trying to look over.
"Abandoned your master? Or was it he who abandoned you, Anova?"
Anova rocked back on her heels. Before her was Helmir, his deadly smile showing past his lips. She hated the way he'd said her name. Breathing in, she remembered her hidden weapon. It wasn't much, but it gave her a drop of courage. "Get out of my face, Fae! I tire of your kind for the night." She crossed her arms. "Shouldn't you be reveling?" As she spoke, she struggled to track the group of guards. Something was happening. They were taking her somewhere.
"Some of us revel in different ways, human."
Helmir had crossed the small distance between them in her distraction. He towered above her. The feathers from his shoulders tickled her face. "I have no time for grackles and their babbling."
"You've barely thought it over,"
Helmir said with a sideways grin, and his hand came to the side of her face in the barest of touches. "Don't touch me, or
what?"
Helmir said. His eyes were dull as they took in her necklace.
"Your master will hurt me?
Stick me above a pit and roast me?" In Anova's silence, Helmir had all the confirmation he needed of what her next words would have been.
"Oh, I think he'll be distracted for the rest of the night,"
Helmir said in answer to his own question. He stepped to one side, unblocking her view, and she saw them. Leander and Lycasta. She couldn't see Leander's face, but he didn't seem to be fighting to get away from her. Anova blinked. What did it matter, anyway? They were only playing roles here. She had no sway over what Leander did in his personal life, and he hers. They were business associates. A burglar and her target, that is, she corrected. But that didn't mean she wished to speak to Helmir or even be in his presence. When she looked back at him, she realized the Fae was blocking her well with his body. She could hardly see over him to the room beyond. This could be a problem. She didn't have time for Helmir's games or Leander's distractions. She might be the only one trying to do her job here, but she'd do it. But there's something I want to do first. At once, Anova's body stiffened. She recalled the sensation she'd felt when she'd last seen Madame Hinterfell and her hired muscle. Her stomach dropped from the memory, and her lips parted. "Your Majesty," she whispered, moving her head down to bow. Helmir twisted his body like a snapped whip to look behind him where Anova had been staring. There was no one there, and Anova was already ducking through a crowd of dancing Fae when she heard Helmir curse her. Exhilaration filled her. She'd tricked the trickster. She found the hallway easily enough. Now that the wall of guards had thinned from the edges of the room, she could see the arches leading to other parts of the palace. She hoped this one led to the archives that Leander had spoken of. But first, there was something she needed to check on. It didn't take her long to catch up with the king's Fae guards. Anova held her breath. standing behind a marble bust of a fae that was cold to the touch. As she peeked from behind it, she saw that it wasn't going well. Her stomach clenched, and she swallowed back her feast. It wouldn't help anyone to be sick here. The fae girl had clearly been dragged across the floor. Her hair was wet with blood. There was a visible slice on her cheek, though she guessed that there were likely other wounds. Petals that had been woven into her hair were scattered across the hall floor, leading to where the guards were still crowded about her. "Who are you working with? Speak and we'll make your death quick," said one of the guards. Her spear blade poked into the fae girl's chest. Her dewdrop dress was torn already. "No one." Despite what she'd suffered, she looked up at them and spoke through clenched teeth with clear fury. "I wasn't conspiring to kill the king. They were hairpins before you destroyed them. But you wish to see ghosts and shadow figures." It was worse than before. There was little warning for it. With barely a heave backwards, one of the king's guards buried the blade of his spear in the fae girl's upper arm. At the same time, a scream tore from the fae girl's lips. Then her other hand flew to her mouth, biting down on some fingers in a visible effort to quell the pain. She doesn't want to draw more of them to her, Anova realized. And then, they're going to kill her now. Anova's heart pounded, and her palms became coated in a sheen of sweat. She hadn't meant to become a witness to murder. Not again. Not again. In her mind, she couldn't stop seeing the Fae lady's head hit the forest ground. But why should she get involved this time? Anova was sure the Fae wouldn't do the same for her. Besides, what could she do against so many armed Fae guards? She didn't even have 2 sharp hairpins to stab through their throats. You have something else. Something better. Without thought to guide her, Anova's hands went to the object pressing into her skin from within the bodice. Her hands trembled. If she made so much as a noise, she would be next. She couldn't be caught. There would be little excuse for her actions and the substance she possessed. In the hall down from her, the guard who had impaled her arm drew out his weapon. Blood was already pooling underneath the wound, and he aimed again. This time, it was for her heart. Anova hoped this was the moment that all Fae eyes would be on the impending execution. She darted out from behind the bust to improve her aim, unscrewed the flask, and hurled its contents into the space between her and the group of Fae. She was right. None of their eyes looked behind them, even when the liquid Fae magic splattered across the polished hall floor. Except one pair of eyes. The Fae girl should have been looking up at the blade about to impale her, but her eyes went instead to Anova. She wasn't sure if there was anything there, if even surprise registered on her face, because Anova shoved herself back in the too tight space between the wall and the bust in almost the same moment. When she dared to peek an eye past the bust again, she wasn't disappointed. Anova hadn't known what effect the moonlight nectar would produce, but it was going better than she could have planned. She had figured the Fae magic would have provided a distraction enough for the Fae girl to get away if she were smart. But this... The droplets of silver liquid bounced against the floor in one moment, and in the next, a cascade of shimmering white snakes flooded the hall. Their massive bodies wriggled over one another to get to the Fae. Just like with the black plants produced by Leander's Fae magic in his greenhouse, she had never seen such snakes. The first Fae guard had stood her ground, her spear blade angled before her like the weapon meant anything to a snake. They started for her leg first, some biting and others climbing to find more pockets under her black armor. In the chaos, she lost track of the Fae girl. Anova didn't move, hoping against hope that the hell she'd unleashed wouldn't come for her. At first, the majority of the Fae guards rallied against the snakes, but as the creatures' long and impressively thick bodies curled around them, they started to run rather than risk their fangs or constriction. The last Fae left was one of the guards and was on the ground where at least 3 snakes were curling around his limbs. One was nearly at his neck when he stumbled to his feet and successfully pried off the snakes using his spear blade. Their bodies hit the ground with 3 distinct thuds. Anova swallowed. The hall was empty now except for the beasts still writhing on the ground. Her nails curled into her palms. Would they attack her too? She didn't get the chance to find out. After a handful of seconds, the remaining snakes moved in a wave across the polished floor in the direction that the Fae had disappeared. If she didn't know better, she would have thought they liked the taste of Fae flesh. For what felt like the first time in minutes, she breathed. The hall was truly empty now, and she carefully rose to her feet, listening for any sign of approaching Fae. As she walked towards the palace where the guards had nearly killed the Fae girl, she looked to either end of the winding hall she'd found herself in. Back towards the moon-mad celebrations? She looked to the other end. It had been the direction in which the guards and snakes had taken, but then it was farther inside the palace. She'd come here for a reason. Her hands tightened into fists. After meeting the High King, she was surer than ever that he'd had a hand in her mother's death. Now, all there was left to do was to find the hard, irrefutable evidence. Something wet smacked against the back of her neck from where she'd pulled her hair to one side. When she touched the spot, her fingers came away red. Her heart dropped into the pit of her stomach. Slowly, Anova looked up. Chapter 17. A pair of eyes looked back at Anova. It was the Fae girl who the guards had nearly killed for wearing hairpins. Her wide eyes were centered on Anova. She was clinging to a rafter, and Anova couldn't fathom the strength it must have taken to do so. She'd torn some of her dress into a makeshift tourniquet, but the fabric was splotchy red and dripping at a slow rate. The Fae was silent as she stared back down at her. She must have seen it all. Anova's head jerked down when she heard footsteps. They echoed down the hall from the direction she'd come from. There was nowhere to hide. Foolishly, she hadn't kept moving when she'd given up her cover. She knew better, and it was too far a distance to squeeze herself into by now. Just as she resolved to stand her ground and explain away her presence with her natural charm and quick thinking, she saw who it was. Anova nearly slumped to the ground.
Anova, Leander breathed when he saw her. I've been looking everywhere for you.
Just as her cheeks warmed against her will and she was about to open her mouth, his eyes narrowed on her and he added,
What have you been getting into?
She resisted the urge to roll her eyes. Always suspicious. I was eating, in case you forgot that humans do eat, she said. And then Helmir found me. At the name, Leander's eyes darkened.
What did he do?
Nothing. He left me alone. She wondered if he believed that. From his expression, she supposed not, though he didn't seem to linger on it.
And that led you here?
Anova shrugged in response. For some reason, she didn't feel up to revealing what she'd seen. She doubted Leander would side with the High King and would want to turn in the Fae girl for such a ridiculous reason, but she hadn't quite yet figured out his limits when it came to what he wanted most. Perhaps he'd think that the deed would curry the Fae King's favor. Anova spoke, her eyebrows slightly arching to the ceiling. She resisted the urge to look up. It was my assumption that we came here to do something, and I was trying to do something. Besides, she said as her voice lowered to a murmur and her eyes darted away, I believe I've danced enough for the rest of my life.
That's understandable.
Sharply, Anova looked up to Leander's face. She hadn't expected this display of decency and didn't know what to say.
Somehow, Leander said when she didn't respond, you were going in the correct direction. Or were you aware of that?
You doubt me overmuch, Anova said, her previous mood returning. Inside her veins, her blood thundered. Soon. She would soon know if the Fae King had directed her mother's death. Before they walked on, Anova glanced up. The Fae girl was gone. Blessedly, the archives room was close. Anova swore to herself that Leander had a nose for parchment, scrolls, and old books, for when they slipped through the doors, those things were all she saw. They were stacked in shelves as far as the ceiling, and she couldn't see to the end of the room.
Keep watch for his guards here. I'll start searching deeper in where the older archives are likely to be, Leander said.
I won't be doing that, actually. Anova crossed her arms. Although you're free to do as you want. Leander's face went still, and the shine that was normally in his eyes was gone.
Excuse me?
I'll signal if I hear anything, but I have my own goals here, Wolfsbane, Anova said. Perhaps you should listen and hide if you hear them coming. Leander looked as if he were containing himself, though just barely. He closed the distance between them.
Did you forget that I hired you to do this job?
She looked up into his face. She wouldn't be intimidated by his anger. Although not specifically this job. Leander revealed a row of pointed teeth in a fake saccharine smile.
If you want to be paid, this is the job you'll do.
Anova stared without breaking contact. They could fight all he wanted, but they had limited time here. She needed him to understand. You asked me what I wanted before, Anova said. This is what I want. Leander was silent for too long as he looked at her. He turned away as he finally spoke.
Fine.
It didn't sound fine, but Anova didn't contest his word. Leander disappeared past the nearly sky-high shelves of ancient documents. As she looked around, she realized she didn't know where to start. Her fingers trailed the spines of books much older than her grandmother. She was careful to leave as few marks in the dust as possible. Are they organized by topic or date of entry into the archives? Anova visualized what she needed to find. Any record of the current High King's life, or better yet, a list of his courtesans would do. Although Fae and humans spoke the same tongue, the Fae's style of written runes were hard on her eyes. She replaced a scroll detailing how Fae had split into 4 regions and why. It was probably useful information to know, though she felt her eyes would cross if she read more of their text. Anova pressed her head against the spine of a book not covered in dust. This was a job that should take several days, if not weeks. They had the rest of one night. She froze and then stepped back several paces. Every other text here was covered in a thick layer of dust. Why wasn't this one? With her forefinger and thumb, she plucked the book from where it had been shoved against its neighbors. When she saw the title, she frowned. Culturally Significant Exports of Fae. She rolled her eyes. Significant to them or us? As Anova moved to place the book back into the shelf, she stopped. There was a book nestled in the shelf behind the space that the other had occupied. Her heart rate crept up. Had this text intentionally been hidden? She slipped back the spines of a few other books to find that there were none hidden behind them. Anova placed the first book on the floor and pulled out the second by its spine. She could tell by the feel of it that it was a much older tome. She feared the binding was loose, and she pinched it to keep it together as she slipped the book between its sisters on the shelf. Her thumb grazed its soft cover. There was no title embossed into its leather. As soon as she started reading the first page, her eyes ached in their sockets. This was a text from many generations ago. A pair of runes near the bottom of the page made her pause. They were Fae and Crown. The breath staled in her lungs. As she looked through the tome, she realized something. This could be it. Anova shut the book and held it lightly between her thumb and fingers. What she held was likely what Leander was looking for. But not the answers I'm searching for. For many seconds, she considered replacing the book behind its counterpart and continuing her own search. Eventually, she could even suggest to Leander to search in the area that she'd found the hidden tome.
Did you forget that I hired you to do this job?
She almost put it back. Almost. Anova strode past the shelves before she could decide against helping Leander. She wondered why she was going through the trouble. It wasn't as if she were going to assassinate the High King. Though perhaps the idea wasn't an objectionable one anymore. The more she thought on her mother's killer, the more her blood rushed through her with an adrenaline that didn't belong in an archives room.
Someday, I will find who you are, and I'll kill you myself.
A noise startled Anova. Her footfalls had been silent, as she'd trained herself how to walk without hulking about at a young age. She darted behind the nearest shelf as she saw a flicker of shadow pass between the shelves where she'd started her search. It's Leander, surely. She rejected this appeasement to herself. It couldn't be Leander. She'd seen him head in the other direction at the start of their search. Dread boiled in her belly. Has someone been watching me? She needed to find Leander. Anova darted on light feet for the next shelf and then for the next. She pressed herself against the stacks and tried to control her breathing before she rushed to the next set of stacks. She hadn't seen the shadow again, but that didn't mean this person wasn't following her. It probably meant the opposite, especially since her pursuer wasn't making any noises either.
What are you doing?
Anova felt like her heart had been squeezed inside a fist. She felt faint. It was only Leander, but there was no way to tell how close her pursuer was. His tone changed in an instant. He moved beside her as he whispered to her.
What's wrong?
She couldn't believe he'd spoken again. She turned from him, looking towards the front of the archives. It looked empty. She moved behind the stacks once more. As she was about to tell him her suspicions, they heard a sound. It wasn't a loud sound by any measure. Anova imagined that it was the sound that a loose floor tile might make if one stepped on the wrong corner of it. It was the sound of a rock shifting in place, or a knife scraping a plate. By itself, it was hardly significant. What was significant about it was that neither Anova nor Leander had moved. Leander seemed to understand immediately, and she was grateful for it. They shared a look before Leander jerked his head towards the far corner of the archives. It was their only option. As she followed him towards the far reaches of the archives, she heard no more noise and saw nothing more between the stacks. But she wasn't convinced that the third person in the archives had left. She realized they'd reached the end when their backs pressed against one final stack, and she stared at the archives wall. But there was no door here, or even a window to escape out of. Anova looked down. Somehow, she was still carrying the ancient book. She pressed it into Leander's hands. His eyes widened as he began to study it, and his mouth parted as if in question of where she'd found it. It was too much to hope that they'd lost their pursuer. She searched for a gap in the books stacked on the shelves and found one that allowed her to see out of without moving from behind the final book stack.
Now, where are you?
A sheen of sweat began to coat her skin. He was clearly there, walking among the shelves of scrolls and books. It was the High King. And he was walking straight for them. There was little chance he hadn't seen them before. She felt her hands start to tremble. Her breath came too fast. Leander had surely brought a weapon to the fate. They'd get out of this somehow. At least there didn't appear to be any guards accompanying him. Anova went back to Leander. Pulling his attention away from the book, she mouthed the news. It's him. Leander's eyes seemed to lose their focus. Anova's heart thudded in her chest. Fae magic? She mouthed. He shook his head. Away from the cover of moonlight as they were, it seemed he was unable to pull it from the air. He can't do anything to save us. were going to be dragged out into the hall and executed. She didn't think. She couldn't allow herself to. As she moved, the dull sound of boots hitting the tile floor got louder and louder. Jerking the book from his grip, she shoved it behind more texts on the shelf in the fashion that she'd originally found it. That took care of the worst of the incriminating evidence. He was nearly upon them. She thought she heard the sound of metal scraping against the floor. Think. What reason would we have to be here? Some buried part of her knew the answer, even if her mind refused it. But they were out of time. They needed to do something. Now. Leander still hadn't moved. Anova was before him, and she started by unbuttoning his coat. Bare skin peeked from underneath, and she silently thanked him for his vanity tonight. When she started to untie her dress from the back, she found it useless to try by herself and gave up. It was then that Leander's eyes focused on what she was doing. He understood. With a shrug, his coat fell to the floor, and his bare skin pressed against her as he brought her close. It allowed him to reach the ties holding up her dress's upper half. Her heart felt like it had squeezed itself into her throat. "Follow my lead," he whispered into her ear. Instead of undoing her dress, Leander's face brushed against hers, his lips pausing before her mouth. He inhaled, and she felt his heart rage against her chest. "Is this what you want?" he whispered against her mouth. Anova couldn't quite seem to complete the thought. She couldn't decide who had asked that. Leander the Fae, who pretended to have stolen away a human plaything, or Leander the Fae who found her, at best, an irritating but necessary partner. Or some other Leander. Thoughts such as these fluttered from her like leaves in the wind. She responded by moving her lips into his, and it was the slightest of touches. She leaned into him, pushing him against the shelf, her hands locked into his. His lips were soft, softer than they looked by far. Leander kissed her back, and she suddenly realized that was what they were doing. She couldn't keep track after that. He kissed her like she was a well of water and he was dying of thirst. Anova pressed harder into him, and heat spread through her like a fever. If she was a well of water, he was the sun. As soon as one of her hands went to the back of his head and buried in his hair, his hands went to her body. When a gasp escaped her lips, he pulled away from her. A throat cleared. They weren't alone. Anova was suddenly very glad they hadn't disrobed entirely. Although she'd known that the Fae King had been here, she hadn't guessed that he'd let it go so far. Next to her, Leander moved himself between her and the High King with a slight angling of his body. The High King's eyes were bright in the gloom. Hedonist. Something soured in Anova's stomach. The more she learned of the High King, the less she liked, which was impressive in itself considering he was the king of all Fae. "Your Majesty," murmured Leander, "you haven't caught us on our best behavior." For emphasis, Leander pulled her closer to him, his palm somewhere against her waist.
"Don't apologize,"
the High King interrupted.
"Wolfsbane, Anova."
He grinned as he said her name. She wished she hadn't given it to him. It felt too personal. But what he said next drove out all her other thoughts.
"I want you in my court."
Chapter 18. Too many questions swirled about her head. Anova couldn't seem to think straight, and she hoped that she would start thinking clearer once the sun rose. Nerium hadn't been at the gates of the East Woe Palace to take them home as he had been to drop them off, but Leander hadn't seemed particularly surprised by that. The cool pre-dawn air had pressed against her skin when they'd arrived at the Wolfsbane estate, and the smells of thousands of flowers made her even dizzier than she had been. It was like inhaling honey. What happened at the fete? How did we survive the Fae King? What does it mean to be in his court? She had her suspicions, but just as she was about to launch into them, Leander disappeared inside his family's manor. When she followed him inside, Leander had frozen before her. There was a large pool of blood puddled on his polished floor. At regular intervals after that, beads had dribbled to the ground. They led away from the back door farther inside. Before she could follow the trail, Leander held a hand out to stop her.
Stay here. It could be dangerous.
Obviously. Anova's eyebrows raised. Which is exactly why you need me to cover your back. You were pretty useless earlier, in case you forgot. But she didn't say that part out loud. Leander shook his head in lieu of providing a coherent argument to that. He was gone before she could blink again. Anova's shoulders slumped, and she pressed herself against the outer wall of the Fae manor. For the first time since she'd risen that afternoon, she allowed herself to simply be. Her fingers raked her hair. When had she let things get so muddled? What had all that meant to Leander? Had it meant anything at all? What had it meant to her? Nothing. It's my job to pretend to be someone else here. Her goal was clear. Steal enough riches from this Fae and leave with them to free herself and Juris from their creditor. Then why was she considering this Fae-brained plan? The High King could be the one, her mind argued. Even with her hands planted in her hair, she couldn't stop them from shaking. All the Fae did was take. What they were best at taking was that which was irreplaceable. Lives. Anova swallowed. She still had no proof that it had been the Fae King, though the pieces had slotted into place too perfectly for her to ignore. All she needed was another morsel of information about the king. All she needed was to speak with the right Fae. But what if getting another morsel of information kept her here past the next moon? Would the answers be worth the price? Or would Juris's freedom be worth foregoing those answers? Anova shut her eyes. Her feet ached, and it felt good not to move. I have to finalize the last pieces of my own plan. Soon. She opened them again. It was too quiet. Anova came to the arched doorway leading into the dining room. A quick peek inside revealed that it was empty, though the blood splatter continued on in another room. Her back pressed against the walls as she went. Although perhaps she wasn't always as quiet as a Fae, she liked to think she was a fair rival to one. Dust swirled behind her as she moved from room to room. Her heart thundered, making up for the silence. She was fairly certain she knew where the blood trail was leading. When she was outside the kitchens, she pressed her palms against the wall. Her breathing stopped. She waited and listened. After several seconds, she felt it. They were small, but she had picked up on the vibrations from inside the kitchens. She didn't have to know what they were to know that there was someone, maybe more than one, inside. Anova came to the doors, careful not to bump them open. She pressed an ear against the gap between them and the floor. For many seconds, there was no speaking but a barrage of noises like pots and pans behind thrown about. She started to worry that Leander was fighting their intruder with kitchenware when she heard his voice.
You're stable, I think.
Leander's voice ended in something like a sigh.
How bad is the damage?
Anova was relieved to hear that the other voice was Nerium's. But then, he's the one bleeding all over the place. Why?
No one saw me, I assure you. This is from one of his traps. As we agreed, I left no trace.
Leander's dry laugh bounced across the spotless floors of the kitchens to her ears.
I actually meant you this time. How are you feeling?
Nerium paused.
I don't think I'll be doing that again for some time. If we're successful, you won't have to,
Leander said. She heard him suck in a breath then.
Nerium, she found it. The book. Are you certain it's the same one? No, but it was from the right time period,
Leander said.
I only saw some of its contents. It told of an ancient Fae crown artifact. It has to be the same one.
There used to be more than one ancient Fae crown, Miriam corrected. Though if it was important enough to be in the archives, it certainly could be referring to the blood crown.
Regardless, Leander said, we'll be moving forward with or without it. Its origins were just an extra piece to the puzzle. We don't need to understand why it came about to destroy it.
Miriam tutted. Not the attitude I would expect from the book and histories lover. For some reason, this gave Leander pause. His voice was low when he spoke.
I'll remember that.
Anova's brow furrowed into lines. His response didn't make sense. Miriam had clearly been taking a rare jab at his master. She rolled her eyes. He seemed immune to the attempts of others to give him any humility. Was his ego that inflated? She feared it was.
Do you believe that she can?
It was Miriam's voice. Anova stilled against the floor. If either of them opened the door, then they would find her sprawled against the floor, her hair in a mess and her skirts bunched from where she'd tried to get comfortable against a hard surface. She wasn't sure that she wanted to hear the answer from Leander. As she simultaneously dreaded and craved his response, another thought occurred to her. When the two Fae were alone, they were much less formal with each other than perhaps was demanded by an employer-employee relationship. Anova decided then. She didn't want to hear either doubt or an affirmation from Leander. It was time to join them. She rose to her feet while not allowing herself to make any noise. Anova took several steps back from the kitchen's doors, and then she started for them in a loud run. Better for him to doubt her than believe in her. As she burst through the doors, she panted for good measure. With her shoulders raised and her hands before her like she had prepared herself to fight off an intruder, her eyes went to each corner of the kitchens. When she spotted them, she let her body release its tension. They looked as surprised to see her as she pretended to be. That was a good sign that they hadn't heard their eavesdropper. And then she saw the blood. She didn't have to pretend then. What happened? The words scratched in Anova's throat. From the volume of the blood everywhere, it looked like Miriam was lucky to be alive. The Fae manservant was paler than normal, but aware and breathing. He was spread out on top of one of the kitchen counters. A bandage had been wrapped tight around his midsection. Sweat beaded his forehead. Before he could speak, Leander said,
While we were at the fete, Miriam was gathering information as well.
As Anova stared at him, she saw something that made her jaws loosen. At Miriam's waist were the two daggers that she and Leander practiced with, sheathed in leather sleeves. The sight shouldn't have surprised her, but considering Fae's oppressive laws, it did. Miriam caught her staring.
Did you think the servant of family Wolfsbane wouldn't know how to handle a blade?
His lips curled into a smile.
I'm afraid I'm not so docile as that.
She shook her head. I should have known better than to make such assumptions. She smiled back in respect. She thought of the Fae and the gleam they got in their eye when they had a devilish thought. Next time, I will refrain from such a thing. Anova processed the entirety of what Leander had said. What information had he been gathering that could have resulted in such a grievous injury? What did you find out? Anova said, slowly, as if she were measuring out each word.
When the High King throws these quarter-moon celebrations, most of his guards accompany him for obvious reasons. There's no reason to guard an empty castle.
Leander's eyes gleamed.
While there are no written blueprints or maps of the Fae King's stronghold, it would be an infinitely useful thing to have for what we're planning.
Anova stared at them. She agreed. And? Instead of responding verbally, Leander pulled a bundle of parchment rolled together from the counter and offered it to her. She took it. Her eyes scanned the sheets of paper. Just how big is this stronghold? But the maps answered that question. Too big. Big enough to hide in, Leander shrugged. All that matters is we find a day and time when the bastard is alone, or that we can force such a situation. His palms came down on the kitchen counters. But one thing at a time. What matters now, more than anything, is that we're in. Anova's eyebrows came together. What does being in his court mean? What are we doing now? It was Nerium who responded. His eyes had closed, and she wondered if he should be in a bed rather than on a counter. He invites others to his court for a variety of reasons. There are his guards, but his court is more than them alone. It includes everything from his courtesans to his advisors, as well as individuals he considers his entertainment. Anova moved her gaze to Leander. And we are? But she already knew the answer. It had been in the High King's eyes when he'd been watching them share an apparent secret tryst in the archives. They were to be his entertainment. Leander's eyes were dull. A human and fae pairing is a bit of an oddity, though it isn't unheard of in our culture. Likely, the High King wishes to see how this plays out. When Anova's only response was a puzzled look, he added, Since our kind lives so much longer than humans, such pairings can sometimes end in tragedy. For both sides. She swallowed. She understood now. He thinks you'll be so upset with my death that... Anova couldn't finish the sentence. Leander shrugged for the second time. Of course, it could just be the novelty, or the audacity of a display of affection between two species. Leander appeared to consider whether or not to tell her more. He continued. Because of our inability to produce more than one child in one pairing, our kind often take more than one partner. Perhaps he wishes to see if a human-fae pairing would be good for the fae. Anova made a sound in her throat involuntarily. She had many thoughts about that. But she was certain that last one wasn't the reason. After all, if he'd wanted to test if the fae would reproduce more rapidly when humans were involved, then he should have kept the child he'd fathered with Anova's mother. I don't know that with certainty yet, she reminded herself. Even so, her nails dug into her palms. Regardless, all fae were bastards. So, Anova said, eyeing the two fae. We're in his court, then. What's next? Leander stepped back from the counter where Nerium was. As much as I wish to move forward with the situation more directly, there are two thorns in the plan. Despite his words, his eyes gleamed. He seemed most at home with this kind of strategizing. Leander held up one finger. First, with the quarter moon past, the full moon is less than a week away. While our magic is stronger with a fuller moon, so is that of his guards, if it comes to a fight. Second, he said as he held up another finger, we need as many of us fit as possible. We should wait for Nerium to recover before attempting anything. Anova looked at the fae manservant and chewed her lip. Nerium's eyes were still closed, although his chest rose and fell in regular intervals. I don't have that long. As if he could feel her gaze on him, Nerium suddenly opened his eyes and narrowed them at her when he found her staring. We heal quite a bit faster than your kind. I would hope. There was too much blood here. She looked elsewhere, silently tallying the days that had passed in Fae. Did time work the same here as in Urbes? She shuddered to think that it was passing faster. And add another week to that, at least. It wasn't a comforting thought. The days she had left were too few for her and Juris. A new thought presented itself. If one of them is injured, even bedridden, then that's one fewer fae to stop me from leaving. While she didn't look at the twin knives at his waist, she didn't have to. She could imagine the damage that Nerium could deal with such weapons. Better for me, then, that he's out of the action when I enact my plan. How soon? Anova said, and the words came too fast out of her mouth. Leander's head whipped to hers. Her lips pressed together. She needed to do better. She tried again. She needed to be more human, slower, less direct. How soon do you think until he summons us to his court? I wouldn't be astonished if it weren't within days, Leander said. Anova looked away. She could still feel his eyes on her. She didn't have the time left to puzzle out what was going on between them. In fact, it was beginning to sound like she didn't have any time at all. Chapter 19. Again. Barely seconds had passed between Leander's commands. He'd deflected her first attempt in those seconds. Anova stifled something between a snarl and a groan and came for him again, aiming low to make him double over. But he was too fast. Leander's body moved around hers like he was water and she was the bend in the river. She hated it. Anova rolled out of the way before he could get his hands on her. At least she was good at that. When she stood again, he said from a few paces away with an impassive face, "Now try it like you mean it." Anova bit the inside of her cheek. She'd been giving it her all tonight, in fact. It hurt to consider that she hadn't so much as touched him, but she wasn't about to let him see even an ounce of that. She kept her face blank as she decided what to do. At last, she'd have him on his backside tonight. Anova darted for his side, her arm pulling back for a strike at his ribs that would be sure to bruise. Leander's Fae eyes tracked the movement, and his body caught up in no time at all. He was going to counterattack with an open palm to her face. Broad, effective, insulting. At the last possible second, she pulled back to complete the feint. The world blurred around her and she was at home. Anova didn't have to think. Her body knew what to do. Leander's body weight was still balanced on his right side in the direction of her feint. She hooked her leg around his left leg to swing it out from under him and stumble him. Instead of that happening, however, his hand darted out faster than she could see it. A pain raced from her shoulder down her spine. Somehow, he'd gotten behind her to pin her arm against her back. "I told you! I haven't held back!" Anova snapped before he could say more. Tears sprang to her eyes from the pressure he was exerting on her arm and shoulder. Her breathing came too fast. She needed to do better. It wasn't just her life on the line here. Juris was waiting on her success. She needed to do better for him. She gritted her teeth. She was good for a human, but that was nothing compared to Fae instincts. What was more, being this close to him reminded her of thoughts she didn't want to have. But the Leander against her now was a different one than who she'd ran her hands over last night. The feelings wouldn't stay untangled, and her skin raised in bumps. She bit down on her tongue before her body could give itself away in other, more obvious ways. "You need to do better, then," he said from behind her. She couldn't see his face, and she yearned to twist herself to see it as she spoke. Instead, she stared at the earthen wall of his training area. "Maybe you need to do better as an instructor." He released her. When she spun around, he was already walking to the far end of his training grounds. She wiped grime from her face from where she'd fallen during their sparring. They were done. That night, the High King's summons came. They were to appear in his court in 3 nights. Anova's hands smoothed through her hair from where it had been twisted into a tight bun. Sweat had plastered loose strands to her forehead. Her palms rested on the top of the Fae-made vanity as she looked at her reflection in the wide bathroom. Their training had been nothing short of brutal. Her muscles ached, and what Anova wanted above all else was to sink to the floor and remain there for a few hours until sometime noon the following day. Leander had said little. She hadn't touched him during her training with weapons. When he'd thrown his knife to the ground and gestured for her to come at him bare-handed, she'd done even worse. She traced the bruise along her right bicep. Damned Fae. With careful movements, she shed first her undershirt, then her tunic, followed by her pants. She breathed as she closed her eyes. The steam from the bath had started to fill the air, and the warm moisture felt good against her bare skin. Anova tried and failed not to think on all that she had left to do. She had passage out of Fae because she'd stolen that vial of Leander's magic, but she still hadn't found enough treasure to take back with her to Urbess to repay her debt. I could sell that stupid necklace. Her hands formed into fists. She hadn't forgotten about the collar he'd forced her to wear during the quarter moon celebration. There must be something better here. If only she could haul some of this furniture on her back. She snorted. Her escape from Fae would be dangerous enough without such a complication. Anova opened her eyes. Steam had fogged the mirror. She went to the clawfoot tub and lowered herself into it with an audible sigh. Her mind wandered. Inevitably, she thought of the events of the last night. She still remembered the feeling of his skin against hers. She remembered how it had felt to have his hands on her. Even though the water was warm, she trembled. No, that was a performance, nothing more. His unnecessary viciousness and coldness during her training had proven that. What was more, he was using her. It was all Fae like him knew to do, especially ones coddled in excess. Her hands moved over her calloused and blistered feet, and she was reminded of that fact. As her thoughts went to the horrible training session she'd had, she chewed her lip. She should have looked for the entrance into his training grounds, but she'd been too preoccupied by his sour mood to observe much. Not much of a professional thief, are we? Not if I don't steal something soon. Anova? Water splattered across the floor when she jerked up. Her fingers dug into the sides of the porcelain. Where the hell is he? Her eyes went to the bathroom door. It was shut. Had it stayed shut the whole time she'd been in here? What in Fae are you doing here? She said between her teeth. Did he not get enough taunting in earlier? Leander said, I have something to give you. Anova opened her mouth, tried to muster a response to that, and closed it again. But his voice hadn't sounded perverse, or even suave. It had just sounded unlike him. She stared at the closed door, hoping he wasn't about to try to pry it open. Are you sure I'm deserving of it? Anova didn't like the bitter ring to her voice, but she couldn't help it. Her bruise had turned a sickly yellow. I haven't even tried my best. There was a pause before he spoke again. I shouldn't have said that. Something stuck in her throat. This version of him sounded all wrong, and it put her off. She noticed an omission. But you're not wrong, is that right? Anova grumbled. When he didn't respond, she cut short her bath. Without taking her eyes from the door, she dried and wrapped herself in a plush towel from a stack left for her. While jurists might have argued that entering an argument or conflict half-dressed would leave you the more vulnerable party, she thought otherwise. As long as it was your decision, it could give you lots of potential advantages. Distraction, not to mention making the other party uncomfortable. That was, if you wanted to be a little manipulative. He's the one interrupting other people's baths. An eye for an eye, she thought as she opened the door to her rooms. But he wasn't there. She frowned, about to start looking for him, when she saw it. Its edge peeked from her half-open armoire. The moment she saw it in its entirety, she gasped. She thought it was silver at first, but it caught the light in unexpected ways. At some angles it was gray. Against bright light it was a sparkling white. The front of the bodice was formed into a heart, while thin, gauzy sleeves ran down the arms. Silver skirts swept the floor generously.
Uncountable tiny flowers had been sewn into the tulle. It was the most beautiful clothing she'd ever seen. Her lips pressed together. This is what he wanted to give me. Anova collapsed on the bed, her eyes fixed on the dress. She wouldn't understand that Fae even if she were here for 100 years. The more she stared, the more she realized that she'd seen it somewhere before. But she couldn't be sure until she saw it. Despite the aches that went to her bones, Anova rose and dressed in a simple blue slip that she pulled from the depths of the wardrobe. As she descended one of the spiraling staircases to the ground floor, she wondered at Leander's apparent change in demeanor. She narrowed her eyes. There was hardly any use in speculating at the reason behind a Fae's moods. But if she was right, and she'd seen the dress before, well, perhaps it made sense. When she stepped off the staircase, she looked up to the 4 portraits, and her gaze went to the last of the set on the far end. In the mirror position to her husband, the Fae lady felt out of place when Anova compared her to him. It was Leander's mother. The gown he'd given her was the same one she was wearing for the portrait. He'd given her his mother's dress.
It's how I remember her, although I have my suspicions that it's simply because it's what she wore for our portraits.
Leander stepped fully out of the shadows and continued speaking.
I suspect I'll never know if the image is a genuine memory or not.
Anova stared at him. It was perhaps the most he'd ever volunteered about his family. She'd forced the rest out of him, like why they'd died. Anova opened her mouth to tell him that she felt similarly about her own deceased mother, and then promptly shut it. The more your enemy knows of you, the more of you to use. Leander thought of her as human trash from the gutter who happened to be good at lying and thieving. He'd said as much, and she would do well to remember it. Instead of saying any of that, she said simply, she was beautiful. She looked over to judge his reaction, but his eyes were still tacked on the portraits above them.
Leander said, Our first night in his court will be on the night of the full moon. Instead of the traditional festivities, the High King is hosting a fete only for those of his court.
With his eyes still elsewhere, he asked her,
Will you wear it?
Something pinched at her chest. She knew how to handle the cruel, unspeaking Leander, who picked apart her hand-to-hand skills. She even knew how to handle Leander the Pretender. She didn't know how to handle this version of him. She didn't know why he would give her such an important garment when his manservant could get seemingly anything tailored for them. Her voice came out too quiet. Yes. Finally, his eyes found hers.
Will you join me for dinner?
She wasn't sure what expression was on her face as she said, I think I'd rather retire for the night. I only came down to see the moonlight.
As you wish.
Anova nearly missed it as she turned from him, but at the last moment, his eyes flicked from her face to what she thought was the bruise on her arm. But by then, she was already on the stairs back to her rooms. After she scaled them and her breath came too short, she began to regret her stubbornness. It wasn't just her limbs that ached. Her stomach growled, protesting her choice. As she came to her door, she imagined what the Fae downstairs were stuffing their faces with. She swallowed as she thought of fluffy eggs and roasted cinnamon apples. It was your own choice. But she didn't think she could last another minute in the presence of this Leander. She didn't know what to do or say around him. I know what I think of the High King, though. Underneath that hedonistic mask was the capacity for incredible cruelty. But had the Fae King truly murdered her mother? She'd never know in her best. I have to go with him. One last time. One last damned Fae event, and that's it. When she came to her bed, she saw something had been left on the table near it. She removed the glass cloche to reveal a plate of steaming food. How did he get here so fast? But her reservations fell away as she started with the stone mug of herbed, cheesy broth and vegetables. It wasn't the eggs and roasted apples she'd envisioned. It was better. She was halfway done with the soup when she finally noticed what was beside the food. There was a note and a jar of creamy lotion on top of it which smelled of rosemary. For the bruises. Chapter 20. Bright sun roused her from a deep slumber. It was at its zenith, and proud of it, as it seeped through every window into her rooms. She'd cracked open the doors to her balcony, and the smell of blooming flowers wafted in. The sound of bees droned beyond her room. Anova tied her strands into a bun at the back of her head after brushing out the knots from sleep. Before she slipped into her favorite pants and tunic for training, she stopped in front of the mirror. Every night since they'd received his summons, they'd trained with barely any breaks until the dawn. Yesterday, he'd retested her on poisons and introduced her to a few antidotes. There was one night left until the full moon. Her eyes traced her limbs and the curves around her hips. She didn't remember having much of those before Fae. She paused on her arms. Was it her imagination, or was there a layer of visible muscle that hadn't been there before? In the human world, she hadn't had the opportunity for this much training. She was better at both hand-to-hand and weapons than she'd ever been. She smirked and turned from the image reflected back at her. Maybe she would take the mirror with her after all. They were useful things. As she dressed, a noise outside stole her attention. Anova pressed herself against the ajar door and peered out it. She got there in time to see something that stole her breath. A cloud of white and blush-pink moths settled near the carpet of flowers below. They formed a loose swarm until they fluttered away in small groups. Lycasta stepped forward, a tiger moth still clinging to the back of her head. Its stripes of red and orange were mirrored in the colors of the dress that flowed around her. When she walked out of Anova's line of sight, the moth took to the air. Before she closed the door, she heard Leander's voice. However, she was too far to hear any distinct words. Her heart thrummed in her chest. She needed to act fast if she wanted to find out what was going on and avoid a confrontation with the Lady Fae. As quietly as she could manage, she flew down the steps. She strained her ears for any sound, any sign of what she should prepare herself, but she heard nothing. When she hit the polished floor of the great hall, she saw that he hadn't yet opened the door to let her in. As Leander came inside, Anova slammed herself against a column large enough to hide 3 people behind it. To her chagrin, she heard Lycasta's voice. "Who has known you longer, Leander?" She sounded as if she'd caught up to him. "Who knows the real you?" His words were strangely low and clipped when he answered. "This isn't about that." "Then what is it about? Why take her to the highest Fae court and not one of your own kind?" Anova's stomach clenched. She didn't want to hear any of this, but she couldn't stop listening. "Because I'll take who I want. That's it." "As you wish." Lycasta inhaled a sharp breath. "There is another reason I called on you, however." Anova's eyebrows pushed together. Lycasta hadn't seemed to her the type that conceded so easily, but it seemed she'd judged her wrong. "How did you get this?" Leander asked suddenly. She gave him something. Anova itched to look around the column, but she wasn't curious enough to skewer herself by means of a spurned Fae. "I have means at my disposal," Lycasta said. "It shouldn't surprise me that your head is still buried in books after all this time." His response came after a protracted silence. It was quiet, almost inaudible. "Thank you." Something struck deep inside her. Lycasta did know Leander better than Anova did. To look upon them both, It was painfully obvious that they belonged together. Or, at least, he should have one of his own at his side. When they moved out of the room, she released an unsteady breath. She definitely didn't want to hear more of this conversation. Her eyes went to the stairs, but she decided against going back to her rooms. It felt too much like hiding. She crept to the edge of the wide doorway that led to the rest of the estate. Her eyes went to the end of the hall where the dining room was, and she heard their muffled voices. Instead of joining them, she headed for Leander's study. At least one of them should be preparing for tomorrow. If I'm still going there at all, she considered. But she allowed that thought to flee her. He'd refused Lycasta, firmly. With the door shut behind her, she darted through the shelves and around the edges of the room until she was satisfied there was no one else there. She breathed in the reassuring sense of old paper and dust. First, she dedicated several minutes to finding the entry to his underground training area. When she didn't find any sign of it, she gave up and got into one of her favorite stances. Her feet moved across the floor like a dancer's as she imagined an opponent across from her, one of the Fae guards she'd seen before. She ducked under an invisible sword staff, swinging a kick to shins that weren't there. Heavy breaths seared through her, and she moved faster. The world blurred at the edges. Anova ducked and rolled under her imagined opponent's strikes. Blood pounded through her. She'd never been this good before. Movement out of the corner of her eye made her breath catch, but she didn't stop. A figure appeared in her sight and rushed her. Her wrist flicked out, and her hand hovered before her assailant's throat. Anova straightened out of her stance and pulled back from the strike when she saw it was Leander. "Don't sneak up on me like that," she grumbled, turning from him. Next time, he'd wake her up in an arm lock. She dismissed that thought before it went somewhere else. "Where is she?" "I escorted her out." His voice sounded like he was squeezing it out of him. Anova spun on her feet and saw something on his face that froze her breath. "What's wrong?" "As if you don't know," he said between his teeth. He was deathly still. Anova closed the steps between them. "What's your problem? Just tell her." He still hadn't moved, though there was something in his hand now. It was a slip of fabric, though she didn't recognize it beyond that. In a voice colder than she'd ever heard from him, he said, "A simple no would have sufficed from you." She stared at it. "I don't understand." As she stared, she realized what it was from. It was a piece ripped from her dress. His fist crushed the fabric, and he turned from her in a single motion. Leander started for the door to his study. She followed. "Will you ever explain yourself?" she said, her hands fisted at her sides. "I don't know what you're talking about." The Fae moved too fast for her to catch up to him. He'd already left the hallway. What in Fae is all that supposed to mean? Her heart thundered. He couldn't ever be easy to read, could he? Damn it, just tell me what's wrong! Once she passed into the entry hall with the twin staircases, she stopped in her path. It was everywhere. Shredded pieces of silver-white fabric floated in the air like snow. Some drifted from step to step, as if they were alive. Others rested on the stair railing, the trim, and the polished floor. Her heart felt as if it had stopped in her chest. A piece of tulle with a flower sewn into it had come to rest on the corner of his mother's portrait. In the middle of the room stood Leander. A simple no would have sufficed from you. He thinks Leander, I didn't do this. His voice was flat. Then who did? She blinked when it came to her. It was so obvious that it hurt. Lycasta. She was the one who was with me the entire time. Leander finished for her. I escorted her from the premises by the back door. Anova's mind raced. She'd risen from bed, and the dress had been hanging in her wardrobe. When she'd seen Lycasta arrive, she'd snuck downstairs and eavesdropped in the entry hall until they'd left for the dining room. Connected to the dining room was the back door. "She must have snuck back in," Anova said. "And—"
"She left."
His words were short and brutal.
"I watched her."
"Then it was someone else," Anova said in a rushed breath. "Where is Nerium?" As soon as the words had flown from her mouth, she knew it was about the worst thing she could have said. But instead of getting angry, Leander's face went blank. He pushed past her.
"I'll be going by myself tomorrow, and perhaps for the remainder of his summons, however long they last."
She didn't know what else to say. She wanted to say that she hadn't ever wanted to go, but that wasn't the truth. And she wanted to match his anger, but there was none to rise up against. Anova's voice was too small when she spoke. "I could never." With his back to her, he stopped.
"You could never do something like this? And why not?"
When he turned to face her, his eyes were like dark pits.
"You hate us. You hate me. It's clear in the way you speak and act."
And he left. Chapter 21. Her anger came too late, in the hours after and in the following day. Anova had wanted to be angry in the moment. Now it was a useless feeling that ate at her. It had been a setup. That much she was certain of. She was also certain of who was behind it. Aside from possibly the High King himself, there was one person who stood to gain the most from keeping her from attending the Fae King's full moon celebration. Lycasta. Regardless of what Leander had seen, she had to have re-entered. Her plot was clear to anyone with eyes. She was hoping that Leander would take her to the Fae King's court now instead of Anova. But that didn't matter to her anymore. Anova looked up at the night outside. It was nearly time. After what had happened in the entry hall last night, she had spent the rest of the night preparing for her final act in Fae. She smiled without mirth up at the moon. Although she would have preferred a blacker night, some added illumination was a burglar's close friend. She would just have to be careful enough for it not to give her away. She dressed in a pair of dark, tight pants and a loose black shirt. Anova watched as Leander left for the High King's full moon celebrations. She'd been forbidden from leaving the estate without him, but it wasn't as if she were going to start listening to him now. Besides, she had a few tricks that the Fae didn't know about. Anova took the vial of liquid from within her dresser and pressed it inside her pocket. What if I can't find his treasure in time? She nixed the thought. She would find it, and she would get out of this place. After that, she would pawn the Fae ring and his twin knives as soon as she was back in Urbes. It would have to be enough to get her and Juris out of debt. Anova pressed herself against the wall outside her rooms, not even daring to breathe as she listened for any sound of Nerium. When she heard the disconcerting sound of nothing, she proceeded. Her feet moved almost silently across the floor. She'd long ago learned that the floor joists tended to support her weight better if she stuck near walls. Shadows dressed her as she moved down the hall and stairs. It's almost too easy. Anova gave a slight shake of her head. There was no such thing as a too easy pigeon. Moonlight pooled on the floor in the center of the entry hall. Silence pervaded the manor. Despite herself, Anova gave one last glance at the portraits of the Wolfsbane family. As she gazed upon the visages of the dead Fae, she shivered. Fae were unnerving enough when they were alive. When she looked between the twin Fae boys, she realized that she couldn't tell a difference between them. I shouldn't linger here. Anova released a low breath and moved on. She'd hardly left her room since yesterday night, and in that time, she'd realized something about Leander's hidden training grounds. And it was time to test her new theory. Anova closed the door to his study behind her. In all the time that she'd tried to find the entrance to the training grounds, She had seen nothing to give away its position. Anova confirmed this as she performed another sweep of his study, moving tables and chairs as she went. There was no visible sign of a secret entrance. But that was the problem. She was using the wrong sense to find it. In the middle of his study, she stopped, closed her eyes, and thought. If Leander wanted to keep such a thing hidden, something that could be enough to get him and Nerium executed, then the most obvious sign would be something like marks on the floor or a misshapen tile. The entrance has to look exactly the same as what's around it. When she opened her eyes, she didn't look for subtle signs of an entrance. She looked for surfaces that could be hollow. As Anova walked, she tapped her feet on the floor tiles periodically, listening to the sound of their response. Her knuckles rapped on the sides of his bookshelves, and she pressed her ear to the wood as she waited for what she hoped was here. Somewhere. What if I can't find it? What if I can't find anything to take with me? Then I can't go back, she realized. The rays of moonlight stretched until she could see it was nearing its zenith. Sweat slicked the back of her shirt to her skin. If she didn't find anything of value to bring back with her, then it had all been a waste. And after last night, Leander was sure to break their agreement soon. Her skin flushed with blood despite the chill in the air from the night. That damned, stupid Fae. How hadn't he seen the obvious? She'd even shown herself while someone else did her dirty work. Anova's head jerked to the skylight in the ceiling above her where moonlight poured inside Leander's library. How had she known about the dress in the first place? Her teeth bit into the edge of her tongue. How hadn't she seen it before? She was being tailed. The feeling sat low inside her. It was one of her worst fears. Blood beat in her veins. Anova grabbed a ladder, but the instant she moved it, it screamed a creak that could have woken the dead. She stopped in her tracks, listening for the sound of boots, a door opening, anything. This is useless. Nerium is silent. Her palms shook. She would have to climb it here rather than risk more noise by moving it. Treasure or Lycasta? Juris or Lycasta? It should have been easy, but in the end, she couldn't suffer a rat to live. Aware that every second not looking for her bounty was a possible second wasted, Anova climbed the ladder propped against one of the bookshelves. With a gulp of air, Anova pulled her body over the top of the shelf. If she stood fully, she could have touched the ceiling. She crouched as she looked at what had caught her interest on the ground. Her stomach dropped. Crawling across the interior surface of the skylight window was a tiger moth. It's been watching me all this time. It was the thing that destroyed his mother's gown. It was the same one that Lycasta had released when she'd arrived at the Wolfsbane estate. Its antennae twitched as if it could sense Anova's thoughts about it. She must have fed it moonlight nectar. She breathed from her nose and got even lower as she started to move across the height of the bookshelf. When Anova was at the far end of the bookshelf, she straightened from her crouch. At the same time, the moth stopped in its path. Anova eyed the distance between herself and the insect on the window. If she reached for it, she could surely catch it in her fist, though she would be prone to lose her balance against the open air below. Something prickled at the back of her neck. Anova shoved herself against the top of the shelf, flattening her body. Anova felt the pressure change in the room. Someone had opened a door. The Fae's steps were whisper quiet. Anova swallowed. Was Leander back? There were other options, including a worse one. Lycasta. Anova swallowed and peeked over the edge of the shelf in the direction she'd heard a quiet shuffling sound. It was Nerium. He was walking through Leander's library, although his hand didn't leave the stacks as he went. It was strange to see vulnerability in one of the Fae. Even so, she didn't dare move for fear of drawing the Fae's eyes. Miriam's inspection was impressive, and she realized that he would have discovered her here if she hadn't climbed the ladder to the top of one of the stacks. Anova held her breath as the manservant paused. She noticed something then. Strapped to his waist were the twin daggers she'd planned to steal. Her fingers twitched. He was directly below her. If she ambushed him from above, she would stand a chance at taking the weapons. Her teeth dug deeper into her tongue. How many gold pieces would those fetch? Or crown pieces? The longer she waited, the more she realized he was doing something. Miriam was crouched low to the floor. This was where the entrance to his training grounds were. She didn't breathe or move. In the seconds that passed, Anova also realized she wasn't going to attack the Fae for their weapons. His ring will have to be enough to get us out of debt. After Miriam left his study empty-handed, Anova descended the ladder and ran her palms over the tiles that the manservant had inspected. He was looking for signs of entry, she considered. She ran a finger along the sanded grout between some of the tiles until she felt something. It was a notch against one of the tiles, and it was invisible to the eye. Lightly, she rapped a knuckle against the tile. It produced a higher, less dull sound than its neighbors. This is the one. With ease, she pulled the tile away and dragged it to the side. The opening it exposed was large enough for a Fae carrying a human to enter. As the moonlight hit it, she saw notches like ladder steps carved into the side of a passageway that went straight down. Anova started down the shaft as the familiar coolness of the lower elevation tickled her skin. A bleak darkness closed in around her, and Anova focused on counting the notches to keep away the panic that she knew would come. After the 51st step, her knee hit something solid. Anova twisted away from the wall to realize the shaft had given way to the training grounds. She'd made it. Torches and sconces on the wall threw a dim, amber light through the area. Anova swallowed and tried not to imagine the practice dummies watching her with their scratch eyes. On the far end of the cellar, she found it. Her breath caught in her throat. His chest was still there. But when Anova kneeled by it, her eyes locked on something. She froze. There had been a key, one that she'd never seen since. Chapter 22. Her head pounded. She could take the entire chest with her to her Bess. I'll still have to open it there, and if there's nothing inside. Anova shook herself. No one locked a house if there wasn't something valuable inside. What if this is a trap? Anova twisted to look behind her. All that was around her were the blank faces of the wooden dummies. Her palms became sticky. She'd already fallen into one Fae's trap. But I don't have a lockpick. She'd had a nice set of them once. She sighed. They did her no good now. Her hands raked through her hair. I've wasted too much time already. Her eyes shut. She still had her escape. But to come back empty-handed, it would be worse than not coming back at all. Anova opened her eyes. Her hand dug into her pocket for the only object on her. The vial of liquid moonlight swirled against the interior of the glass when she pulled it out. She swallowed dryly as she considered the possibilities before her. This would either get her inside the chest, or it would destroy the chest entirely. Biting the inside of her cheek to stem the shaking in her hands, she pulled out the cork stopper and tipped the vial at an angle. She allowed a single drop to fall on the metal hasp that held the lock through its loop. At once, the latch of the chest began to grow. Anova darted back, and the latch was twice its size in seconds. A few seconds later, it broke off the chest with an audible snap, also breaking the lock attached to it. The latch didn't stop growing until it was as large as the chest itself. Anova released a breath when she dared to move again. She'd done it. Anova's head swam and her hands were on the chest. She might have done irreparable damage to his chest, but she wasn't planning on lingering in Fae to experience Leander's wrath. In fact, she was certain she'd never return at all. Without the twin blades, the chest was nearly empty. Her hands trembled when she found what she'd been looking for all this time. The light of the torches fell on her palm where the ring rested. On a silver band perched a sapphire that was bigger than a robin's egg. An unsteady breath rushed through her. She'd been pawning jewelry since she was a young girl, so she knew that the object in her hand would fetch her a sum of several crowns. Her head felt too heavy. She'd done it. The only other object within was a folded piece of paper. She'd nearly missed it for the ring. Anova couldn't put down the ring. She held it in one hand as the other picked up the parchment. She unfolded it to find that it was a note written in an unfamiliar hand. Her forehead creased as she started to read it. Dearest, I know this will be hard on you. However, you must do whatever it takes to live in this world. For us. For yourself. I'm leaving you the ring your father gave me. I can only hope it makes it to you after this is over. You will miss us, perhaps your brother most of all, but we will always be with you. We love you, Cadmus. Alaris Wolfsbane. Anova sat there for several minutes, staring at the parchment. In the silence, she heard her heart thump inside her chest and cradled the sound close. Carefully, she replaced the note, folded up on the bottom of the chest. She placed the ring on top of it. Alaris had been wrong about which of her sons would survive. Perhaps, in the end, not even their mother could tell them apart. Anova remembered Leander's reaction when she'd outright asked him for the ring as payment for her services. At the time, his reaction had been strange. Vehement, even. Now she knew why. She couldn't steal this. Her body felt numb from the aches worked into it, but she got to her feet regardless. On the outside, she moved with apparent purpose. Inside, she was lost. Her chest tightened. She couldn't stay here, and she couldn't go back, not without something. When she hauled herself over the edge and onto the floor of Leander's study, she saw she was still undiscovered. Anova replaced the tile as it had been, and silently, she left through the back door of the Fae Manor. The night pressed a cool breeze against the back of her neck, and the sweet scent of flower nectar tickled her nose. She took to the shadows like a bird to the air, not stopping until she reached the door of Leander's greenhouse. As she moved, her mind began to piece together a new plan. Leander wasn't the only rich Fae here. As soon as she uncorked the vial of Fae magic, she saw its wings flutter in the moonlight. After she led the insect outside the greenhouse, she stopped. The green butterfly came to land on the edge of her hand. Its wings flapped once before thin spindle legs straddled the vial and its proboscis curled into the glass. Anova watched in awe as it drank its fill. The tiny puddle of liquid disappeared, and it retracted its proboscis before it took to the air before her. The insect's black bead eyes watched her as spindle legs stretched into horse-like ones. The different sections of the butterfly's body morphed together. With a final flap of her paper wings, she stood before Anova, changed into a flying steed. Anova approached her, her hand low but extended. "Do you remember me?" she whispered. Her insectile eyes didn't blink. She wasn't sure they were able to, but she didn't move as Anova approached her. Anova's hand went to her elongated snout. When she ran her hand over her snout, she felt minuscule hairs on the creature's ebony body. "You deserve a name," Anova realized as the steed stared at her. "You're far too intelligent not to have one." As she looked upon the butterfly steed's wings, she decided. Viridia, she said with a slight smile, for your most charming feature. Viridia's eyes gazed back at her with what she hoped was approval. Her thin snout-like nose found Anova's hand. Anova took the gesture as a sign of goodwill and went to the steed's side. Anova narrowed her eyes on the creature's body. She hadn't actually witnessed the butterfly steeds moving like horses when they'd supposedly pulled their carriage. What if she'd gotten this all wrong? It could have been another trick of the Fae. I should have tested this before tonight. Before she could decide against trying, Anova swung one leg over the creature's midsection as she mounted her. She settled just below the joints of the steed's wings, and she was careful not to disturb them in case they were sensitive. Viridia kicked at the ground, though she didn't try to buck her off. She stared down at her mount. Perhaps she'll respond to a command? Anova stared at the hills around them that they'd passed through upon her arrival in Fae. With the illumination of the full moon, she saw much more of the hills than would normally be possible at night. She remembered her journey in the carriage with Leander. The Wolfsbane estate hadn't been the only manor they'd passed. As soon as Anova's sight lingered on one of the mansions for more than a few seconds, Viridia gave a sound that sounded like a delicate snort. Her wings kicked against the ground, and she started galloping for the fields of flowers around them. Before a yelp could escape Anova's lips, they'd taken to the air. Chapter 23. The Wolfsbane Manor was quickly buried in the landscape as Anova and Viridia glided on the night air. Anova's heart had shoved itself into her throat. She couldn't quite believe what was happening. The world shrank from them, and the moisture of the clouds tickled her exposed skin. A smile that felt like it was permanent spread across her face. It was unlike anything she'd known before. The world stretched below them, including the hills and forests that populated Fae. Fortunately, the Wolfsbane Manor was located in the region closest to the Fae-human border. She peeked behind her shoulder at what they were leaving behind. Even in Urbess, she'd heard of it. The High King's stronghold. At its center was a spire that climbed the heavens. It was in the outer reaches of Fae, in the mountainous region called Farstar. Anova shivered and set her gaze ahead of her. There was little use in speculating what would happen in Fae now that she was leaving. Even if she regretted never getting answers about her mother's death. I'm sorry, Mother. Her eyes flicked to the ground below. They were approaching it at a steady pace. This Fae manor was one she'd seen on her journey from the border forests. It was sprawled out over more land than Leander's estate was, though there were markedly fewer forests here. Even so, trees and greenery had spread like a virus across much of it. Anova had an idea. She pressed herself close to Viridia and whispered to her, "Can you get us to the roof?" It was risky, but what was risk when she was already breaking into an unknown Fae's manor? They passed through the lowest of the clouds and back into visibility. Anova kept her head against Viridia's hide, and she hoped that no Fae were looking to the sky in the seconds that they made their sharp descent. As they got closer, she marveled at how moonlight fell upon everything like thick snow. After all, what are the chances that any of these moon-mad creatures would stay indoors during a full moon? Her thoughts were cut off when they hit the shingled roof like a bug against a glass window. The impact traveled through her bones, and Viridia's thin legs scrambled as they fell farther along the slope. Anova grabbed Viridia's neck, but she was thrown from her in chaos. Against the sloped roof, she saw the ground quickly rise up to meet her before her fingers dug into the shingles and she stopped herself. She breathed out of her nose as she tried to calm herself. Viridia had stabilized herself likewise, her black legs digging deep into the roof. Her black eyes met Anova's, and she managed a strangled laugh. "Sorry," she said in a low voice. "First-time flyer." Viridia stared back at her like it was easy. Anova shook her head at the magicked steed. If flying was so easy, then why had they landed so poorly? Because you asked to land on a roof. At once, Anova got to work. In truth, she was much more experienced in sneaking about the insides of buildings rather than their exteriors, but adrenaline flooded her like a river at the challenge. While they hadn't made the most silent landing, she supposed it would force the Fae out of their home to look at what was on their roof, if there were any inside. And if she could clear them from the building, all the better. As she climbed the side of the roof, she found what she'd hoped to find. Hello there. Anova kept out of view as she inspected the skylight window. It was circular, like the moon above it, and tiers of thick glass built upon each other, making the center its thickest layer. From what she'd learned in Fae, she knew there was a high possibility of finding windows like these in most Fae buildings across their lands. To them, no light compared to that of the moon. Her deft fingers found the notch in the framing, and she tested lifting it to find that it wasn't squeaky at all. It wasn't even all that heavy. Fae construction. Solid. As she held it open, she heard silence within the manor. It was an exceptionally good sign. Anova peered over the edge of the window's frame to see a dark room below. Her breath held. She continued to be far more fortunate than she deserved to be. Within arm's reach of the roof window was a chandelier draped with crystals. If she were careful, she could use it to get closer to the floor before jumping inside. She looked up at Viridia and whispered to her, "If they discover you, get out of here." Her eyes went to the window. There was little chance that she'd be able to come back the way she went in. "I'll meet you on the ground." Viridia didn't respond besides puffing air through her slender snout. Anova opened the window just enough for her to partially crawl through it, holding tight to the latch. Her blood thundered, and her breathing picked up. She knew these were signs her body was giving her, warning her of danger, but they couldn't drown out the thrill that filled her to the brim. She'd been built for this. Her sense of balance was far better than most humans, and she relished that fact. As she looked to the floor, she almost wished for an audience. She glanced at the chandelier. The key to not overwhelming the fixture would be to apply her weight to it gradually, and then release from it as soon as she could. Although she guessed that the chandelier was sturdier than it looked. At least the Fae are good for something. She rolled her eyes a second before swinging her body weight back. Holding her breath, she rushed forward, her hand on the interior latch of the window releasing only when she'd hooked an elbow around the hanging light fixture. She followed the momentum, swinging with the chandelier where it jerked to one side. The floor danced below her in circles. Despite the chiming of the crystals, no Fae were rushing into the dark room to meet her. Good. She'd planned to land on them, however. Without another body to break her fall, this would leave bruises. It was time to let go. Before she could change her mind and hold on for another minute, Anova released her grip on the chandelier. In the same moment, she tucked herself into a ball and aimed for the ground with her feet. Anova bit her lip to silence the curses rising to her lips. She smacked against the ground too much on one side. The pain spread like a bolt through her, and she cradled her ribs. With any luck, the damage wasn't too severe. When she stood, a sharp pain shot through her. She gasped silently and blinked away tears. Slower, then. Anova took solace in the fact that, if she had broken a bone, she wouldn't be able to stand. She swallowed against the nerves tangling in her chest. She couldn't let her fear stop her. Not when she was in the belly of the beast. In reality, she was luckier than she'd ever been. She'd chosen the one night when all of Fae was sure to be dancing under the moon. Even still, Anova stuck to the edges of the room as she inspected it. Moonlight spilled across the furniture, including several chairs, tables, and a piano in one corner. Anova passed it all, her back straight against the wall as she moved to the wide door leading to the next room. A quick glance around it showed that the next room was empty of inhabitants as well. Better to be careful than caught. She stuck to the shadows as much as possible until she came to what looked to be a dining room. The walls on each side were dominated by windows, and their curtains had been drawn. Pale, white light illuminated the room. Anova's eyebrows came together. Though there was no food in sight, plates and goblets had been left on the table, shining silver in the moonlight. Some of the chairs had been pulled back, as if the house's occupants had been interrupted in the middle of their dinner. I don't like this. Her fingers flexed. She could take some of the pieces of dinnerware. Those goblets looked like they could be true silver. It would put her in direct light, however. She swallowed. After a moment, Anova ducked close to the floor as she moved through the room to avoid the light. Regardless, she still needed to find an exit. But the closer she got to the ground, the more dust she noticed. A fine layer of it had coated the floor, and as Anova looked closely at the cushioned chair near her, she realized something. Dust covered every surface. When she looked behind her, her breath caught. It was so thick that she'd left footprints in it. She had to push forward, but Anova couldn't help the thoughts that raced through her head. For the first time since she'd broken inside the Fae estate, her hands slicked with her sweat and her breaths grew short and shallow. It can't be. With near silence, Anova passed through the door into the next room. As she'd guessed, there was no one here either. But that wasn't what stopped her. In the center of this room was a fountain, and a bronze swan sat in the center of it. Its beak was open, its face to the ceiling. She guessed that was where the water should spout from if the fountain weren't bone dry. On the far end of the room were double doors, gaping open. It looked like greenery had spilled inside the house like a flood overcoming a dam. Fern-like plants spread their fingers across the ground while vines had wrapped themselves around the doors. Thick bushes crowded the area, pushing against the walls like they were trying to overtake the structure. What looked to be an oak tree pushed against the ceiling. Something sour settled on the bottom of her stomach. This estate had been abandoned for many years. The air shifted. Hairs stood on the back of her neck. She wasn't alone. Anova twisted to see what was behind her, only to find emptiness. Her pulse throbbed at a pace that was painful. She hadn't closed the door connected to the dining room behind her. And yet, it was shut. There were no footprints leading from it other than her own. She spun around and growled, "Enough tricks! Reveal yourself!" He stepped from the green gloom edging the walls, one open hand before him. His eyes were like shadows themselves. What is he doing here? Above his open palm danced a white flame made from the shafts of moonlight angling into the room. Her teeth bared. So, it was to be a fight. Before Anova could find something to defend herself with, she realized what it was that Leander was burning. As the white flames consumed the paper, he threw the cinders it left behind on the ground between them. Anova looked at Leander and back at the ashes. There were too many questions bursting to her lips that it was a miracle she got out any words at all. Somehow, she found the one that mattered the most. "Why did you burn her note?" she asked. She'd thought that because he'd locked it in his chest of valuables, that he'd cherished his mother's note, even if it hadn't been addressed to him. But as Leander stepped further into the light of the pale moon between them, she realized how wrong she'd been. "I always thought on the day that someone else found that would be the day I'd die or kill them," Leander said. "Because to have someone other than Nerium know this evidence would have been more damning than any of my other actions." Anova was too aware of her surroundings, herself, and everything. It always got like this when she was confronted with mortal danger. I invite you to try either, Anova said through her teeth. She'd fought him before, and she would do it again. To the death, if she had to. The snarl fell from her face as she pieced together what was in front of her. Or rather, who? You're not him, are you? Anova said. The world seemed to tilt around her. You're?
Cadmus, Leander said, was the name I was born with.
Chapter 24. Anova couldn't speak. The Fae before her studied her face, and she wondered what he was looking for. His words in the greenhouse came back to her.
We went days pretending to be the other. At first, we did it to trick the others. We betted on who would see through the charade. Leander straightened. When none of them noticed, it became a method to learn each other's trades.
Leander's face hardened.
Even Cadmus realized the importance of it towards the end. Not that he knew.
She broke the silence. On the day that it happened, you two had switched places. His voice was hoarse when he spoke.
The sole survivor was always meant to be him, not me.
He stepped back into the shadows as he said,
We didn't know it, but I was destined to die that day. He died in my place.
Leander, she said, but the word caught in her throat. She stopped. It felt like the worst thing to have said. Slight enough to nearly miss it, he gave a shake of his head.
The Fae known as Cadmus died many years ago, he said.
Something in her chest twisted like a wrung-out rag. How long has he lived like this? As the brother who died instead of himself? Anova felt dizzy from the implications. He's had to hide who he is all this time. The High King doesn't know, Anova murmured. That was the answer she'd been seeking. This was what was behind Leander's desperation and anger.
On the day that he discovers his mistake, and the only Fae who escaped his inquisition, he will rectify that mistake,
Leander said coldly. We have to do it before the High King finds out. Anova had been about to take a step towards him, but stopped. Was she really doing this? Up until moments ago, she had planned to leave Fae behind forever. But assassinating the most powerful Fae in a land under his complete authority was no small thing. Her heart throbbed in her chest. There was something else between them than even the matter of the assassination. Why are you here? She asked, her voice too quiet. Why did you come for me?
Because I should have known from the start.
She couldn't see his face, but when he turned, she saw a flash of something there as the moonlight passed over his features. He was staring at her. And he was holding something in his hand. Pinned between his first finger and thumb was the moth with the orange, black, and red markings. Lycasta's spy. Leander closed his hand around it, and smoke leaked from between his fingers. When he opened his palm again, the moth was no more. He continued.
I never made it to his castle. When I came back to my estate, I found this instead of you. Nerium said you were gone.
Leander stepped forward.
The night of the full moon is a dangerous time for a human to be by herself in Fae.
Anova's breathing picked up. She shouldn't forget how the moon affected the Fae. I'm not by myself. I have an accomplice.
Which is exactly how I found you.
Anova turned from him to one of the expansive windows in the room. All of this, his sudden presence, the knowledge of who he really was, the assassination, was starting to make her dizzy. She needed a moment to breathe. What was she going to do? Unbidden, she asked. This building. How many others are like it? When I saw Fae from above, there were many more estates.
In this region of Fae, most of them, they're all empty.
Anova spun on her feet. He's mad, she breathed. Why? Leander's mouth was a hard line.
Out of the 4 regions of Fae, Farstar, Westvald, East Woe, and the Soralands, this one is the nearest to the border to the human cities. Once, the Soralands were filled with many Fae families. Now, so near the border forests, it is filled with more of his guards than those living here.
It was hard to believe that the Fae king that she'd met in Eastwoe, the hedonist, was the same one who had executed entire families. Anova realized something more. You can't refuse his summons, she said. Not if we're trying to avoid his suspicion. Something in his eyes caught on the moonlight. He hadn't missed her use of we. His voice was as smooth as velvet in response.
Are you suggesting we continue this pretense of ours?
He closed the distance between them, and his breath danced on her skin as he spoke.
When the time comes, will you assist me in spilling the blood of the Fae who murdered my family?
Even if his charms were fake, Anova's skin prickled and she felt too sensitive. Her heart slammed into her ribs faster. Even if this was all a farce, she would savor it. Leander's expression was dangerous as he offered a hand to her. She was considering stepping back into this world of enchantment and lies, and it felt too good. But he was dangerous. He was his father's protege, the scheming strategist and the bloodthirsty, vengeful son, not the peaceful recluse who he'd pretended to be. The words were out of her mouth before she could stop them. I will. Anova accepted his hand and he pulled her close in response.
Close your eyes,
he whispered to her. When she did, a wind whipped around her as he twirled her on her feet. She opened her eyes when they stopped and suppressed a gasp. White sparks fell from her like flurries of snow, dissolving as they hit the ground. Her clothes had been transformed. Her burglar's clothes had changed into a black dress that bunched at the waist, spreading into layers of lace and silk that hit the backs of her thighs. The top was sleeveless, and black lace gathered at her throat. Leander appeared to study her reaction.
Do you like it?
She bit at the inside of her lip and wondered if she should tell him the truth. Undoubtedly, it would only serve to feed his monstrous ego. Even so, she did. Too much for it to be temporary, she admitted with her eyes still on the fine details. Small moons and flowers were sewn into the lace.
I knew it,
he said with an insufferable smirk. Before she could do anything about it, his hand was around her waist and they were out of the building and into the cool night. Flying with Leander was like nothing she'd ever known. They were both on Viridia's back, soaring above the low clouds to better hide them from curious Fae eyes. Anova smelled the woods on him. She leaned into him slightly, sniffing the air discreetly so that he wouldn't notice the gesture. She knew he wouldn't let her live it down if he caught her smelling him. However, a deep rumble reverberated from where his chest pressed to her back.
Are you smelling me?
Anova stiffened, but she feared the damage was done. She jerked from him, and in an attempt to cover her tracks, she said, I thought I smelled something rotting.
I told you, Anova. You're a terrible liar.
She could hear the smirk in his purring voice. Her cheeks burned infuriatingly hot. She wanted to turn around and strangle him, but since that would likely result in both of them falling from Viridia's back, she refrained from the gesture. Barely. She bit the inside of her cheek and hoped the pain would serve as a reminder. No more ogling the monsters, no matter how beautiful their exteriors. Chapter 25. The peaks of the far northern region of Fae stood out to her like fingers reaching to the heavens. Even in the geography of their land, their arrogance seemed boundless to Anova. She knew without having to ask when they'd breached the boundaries of Farstar. A light coat of snow dusted everything in sight, magnifying the effect of the strong moonlight. Anova looked through the clouds to the horizon. At most, they had an hour or so left until dawn. Cold air nipped at her legs and arms, and before she could suppress it like she had all the times before, a shiver broke through her control and racked her body. Leander pressed closer to her.
"Should I spin you a jacket from snow?"
he whispered in her ear. She jerked her head in a negative. She didn't need him to baby her. It was then that Leander leaned away from her and then draped something over her shoulders. Anova looked down. It was his jacket. Before she could open her mouth and say what she didn't know, he said,
"Wear it. For the facade."
Anova nodded as she looked straight ahead at the castle emerging from the snow before them. Of course, a Fae such as him would lend his jacket to his human pet, just as one didn't leave a beloved dog out in the winter snow. Anova focused on the task at hand. On the way there, they'd developed a plan. Their appearance here would serve several purposes. First, they couldn't simply ignore direct summons by the High King. Their brief appearance would placate him and avoid any additional suspicion, or so Leander hoped. Second, this could be a golden opportunity for the both of them to get information on their target. She swallowed. If all went well enough, she would be interrogating some Fae tonight. This was going to be the night she got the proof she needed. If she was in Fae, she would find her mother's killer and drag him into justice with the edge of her knife. Even if that was the most powerful of them all, she decided. Viridia soared over the road winding through the maze of snow-capped trees. If it weren't so frigid, Farstar would be beautiful. Their steeds' wings kicked up snow flurries the closer they got to the ground. Her black legs galloped as they hit the earth, and snow dust was everywhere. Anova held tight as they crashed through the snowbank. When they stopped moving, she untangled herself from Leander and Viridia, quickly jerking her hands away from his arms. Leander's eyebrows had raised, but he didn't say anything. Wisely. True to what she'd heard, the castle before them was nothing short of a fortress. Spires rose like lonely sentinels among the flurries, their peaks so severely pointed that snow refused to gather on their exteriors. High stone walls bordered his castle. Anova looked up and frowned. Even on Viridia's back, they hadn't seen past these walls. It wasn't a good sign, to say the least. Additionally, there were no windows or places for footholds. She bit the inside of her lip. Just because it looks impregnable doesn't mean it is. There was more than one way inside a castle. Anova suppressed a smile. Not that she didn't enjoy breaking and entering, but there was something savory about a sucker choosing his own fate. Anova stopped in her path. Waiting at the gates were two familiar Fae. When Leander didn't stop, she jerked forward. She wouldn't be cowed by them any longer. The two blonde Fae were guarding the gates before them, and they were the same ones who had stopped their carriage on the night that Leander had smuggled her inside Fae. The female of the pair crossed her arms and tilted her head at Anova, as if she were a cat trying to get a better look at a bug. "Look, Calyx," she said to the male Fae beside her. "I told you the High King would send us something to eat soon." Her skin crawled, but she wouldn't let her voice betray her emotions. As she picked her words, she remembered what Leander had said to the 3 Fae guards in the forest, the ones he'd suggested had once been his friends. "I see the High King's favor and resources haven't been wasted on you 3. It would have been such a shame otherwise. Dignity isn't so cheaply bought these days." It wasn't lost on her that it was these two that were the ones out in the cold. It couldn't have been a glamorous position, even if they were serving the Fae King. Out loud, Anova said, "Haven't you learned? Dogs get the scraps." Something flared in her eyes in response. But before the Fae could do anything, Leander shoved himself between them.
"We're here on the High King's orders, Iona. Unless you'd care to make him wait even longer."
Calix's expression was flat as he glared at Leander.
A smart Fae wouldn't have kept His Highness waiting in the first place.
His eyes moved to Anova, and she couldn't help but stare back. His irises were the palest blue she'd ever seen.
A smarter human would choose her words more wisely on the night of a full moon.
She didn't miss the threat in the undertone of his voice, but she was silent. There was a grain of truth to that as well. As much as she hated to admit it, even to herself, she was about to be the least powerful being in a room full of moon-drunk Fae.
Use your vulnerability. Be what they think you are, up until the moment your knife sinks into their guts.
Iona was looking at her again. "I'll search the human. You search dear Leander," she said to Calix. Anova wanted to turn around and run, rather than allow this Fae's hands on her. But her boots stayed in place where they had sunken into the snow. Leander stepped to the side, and Calix started searching him. Iona dragged her several feet from the other Fae. She wanted to jerk her arms away from her grasp. She wanted to run from such a poisonous Fae, but she forced herself to stay still. As her hands glided up Anova's legs, Iona asked, "How did it happen?" Anova had expected threats, insults, not whatever this was.
"What?"
she sputtered.
"Did he trick you into it?"
Iona's voice was sharp like the winter wind. Her hands moved her face from one side to the other as she examined her. Anova almost slapped her away. This wasn't a search for weapons anymore. Iona's eyes narrowed at what she saw.
"Or were you one of those humans who always dreamed of escaping into Fae?"
Anova's heart raged faster.
"She's trying to figure out why I came here, if I was forced, or if perhaps there was something in it for me."
This was dangerous territory.
More than that, she's trying to figure out why Leander did this. She's trying to figure out Leander.
The four of them had been friends before whatever had fractured them apart. Anova clung to that fact. "What happened between the four of you?" Anova blurted. Iona stilled too quickly. She didn't say anything. "You used to be friends, isn't that right?" Anova added. Panic clawed her throat. "You two, Leander and Helmir." The males were done with their search. She hoped that neither of them looked over here. Iona moved so fast that it was a blur to Anova. She was behind her, and her mouth pressed to Anova's ear in a whisper.
"Don't speak of what you don't know, little human."
Pain burst behind Anova's knees, and she staggered forward through the snow. Iona had kicked her. Thoughts rushed through her head. Anova had hit a nerve, but what did it mean? She had no time to investigate Iona's behavior. Snow clung to her clothes and smushed against her skin, leaving parts of her wet and shivering. She was glad Leander had given her his jacket. Leander was looking at her when she came back to the gate. She could feel his questions, but there was no opportunity for that now, among enemies as they were. "Nothing," Iona said with a bored expression to the other gate guard. "Send them through. I tire of the human girl." Anova bit back a response, and her blood raged through her. There would only be more encounters like this when they were on the other side of the Fae King's stronghold. She should best get used to it. The ornately wrought metal gates swung open without so much as a squeak. Anova noted that the hinges must have been greased recently. They walked to the doors of his castle without a word between them. The pre-dawn sky was smothered in gray clouds, and she feared to look to the horizon to see how much time there was left. Soon, Leander's magic would fade, and she would be dressed again in her burglar's clothes, and they would have no steed to fly them home. Together, they stepped forward into the stomach of the beast. At once, Anova noticed the change in temperature. The doors opened to a wide hall lined with guards. A sharp-eyed Fae guard with short-cropped hair stopped them before they took another step inside. The edge of his sword staff rested on Leander's chest, though his gaze stopped on Anova.
"What business do you have on this night in the king's court?"
Leander didn't move despite the weapon underneath his chin.
"The High King expects us. Ask him yourself. Leander Wolfsbane and Anova. What a pleasant surprise."
His familiar grackle voice filled the wide hall as he waltzed through it to the two of them.
"And Leander, I can't say it is as much of a treat to see your tired face, my friend."
Helmir's eyes glimmered as he saw the full scene. A mantle of raven's feathers was draped over his shoulders, a wild contrast to the violet suit he wore underneath it. Leander's lips pulled back to show his teeth in a smile that was more of a snarl.
"Likewise."
Helmir wasn't even looking at him anymore. He was addressing the guard who had accosted them.
"If you don't mind, I think I will escort them to His Majesty myself."
His hands had found one of their arms each. Anova suppressed the urge to squirm from the Fae's touch and instead bit at the tip of her tongue. She was doing that a lot lately. She didn't miss the sheathed blade at Helmir's hip.
"Don't touch us,"
Leander hissed through his teeth, though he didn't jerk out of Helmir's grasp. Helmir ignored him. He pushed them both forward where he walked between them.
"You're late. Very late,"
he said in a low voice despite the smirk plastered to his face. As the three of them burst through a set of ornate double doors, Helmir added,
"Lucky for you, you're just in time for the peak of the festivities."
All at once, raucous sound and moonlight-filtered color were around them. The ceiling was open to a porthole above, and pale light flooded the space. White snow fell, though it dissolved in the air before touching the ground. Heat radiated from the floor so much that she was warm enough without sleeves. On the other side of the room was a massive oak grown into one wall, its branches shading the lower half of its trunk. They were in the strangest dining room that she'd ever seen. If it weren't for the food, she wouldn't have called it a dining room at all. Fae of every kind were spread out from one end of the room to the other. Many of the goblin fae she'd seen before were spread across beds of leaves and shredded wildflowers, sticking skewers of food between their sharp teeth. Others, fae from reputable families like Leander, she guessed, were perched on lounge chairs that bordered on beds. Before many groups of fae were stone pits with fires dancing inside them. A spiced, savory smell settled on the air, and Anova realized with another sniff that several types of meat roasted in the pits around them. Goblets brimming with liquid passed from hand to hand. With a shudder, she realized they were drinking moonlight nectar. Fae eyes of every color flew to the three of them as goblets sloshed liquid to the ground. This was the Fae King's private fate, and they'd interrupted it. "You've done well, Helmir." Anova's gaze snapped to the head of the room where the tree was. As she stared, she saw through the thick shadows. Underneath its lower boughs was a throne where the High King sat, smiling with sharp teeth at them. Beside the throne, Malor's red eyes found her, and she shivered. Scattered around the throne were several cushioned lounges where beautiful female and male fae sipped on goblets. She guessed they were his consorts. "Welcome to my court, Anova and Leander," the High King continued. "I'd feared you wouldn't be here for the most important part of tonight." Anova couldn't tell if his mirth was genuine or if it was all an elaborate front. She wanted to lower her head and sit down already. The eyes of so many Fae on her made her skin itchy. She remembered at the last moment to bow alongside the two Fae beside her. When they rose, Leander discreetly shoved his elbow into Helmir's side to move him from between them and the king. When he addressed the Fae king, Leander said,
"It is an honor we wouldn't dream to squander, my lord."
"I would imagine not." The High King still had that smile on his face, though there was something in how he said it that made her think it was closer to a threat than not. "However," he continued, "before we proceed to the reason why my court is holding a closed celebration this full moon, I require something from the two of you." Beside Anova, she felt Leander stiffen his back ever so slightly. She was satisfied to see she'd learned some of his tells by now. But even if Leander was right to be nervous, they couldn't show it. They're like wolves. We can't backtrack, not now, even if it's a trap. She kept her head held high and her eyes on the Fae before them. Her voice came out stronger than she could have hoped. "As you wish, Your Highness." The High King stared back at her, and his smile widened. "That's what I hoped I would hear." He rose, and the moonlight bathed him in its light as he stepped forward. The closer he got, the more she saw of him. Even though his smile didn't falter, his eyes glimmered with an intent that she wished she knew. "What I require from the two of you is simple, really. I already have it of the rest of my court. What I need is a token of your loyalty to me." He stopped among the Fae that he ruled. For not the first time, she was distracted by the blood crown. The ruby set into its front gleamed like fresh blood. "What that token is, I'll leave the decision up to you." Sharp, bone-white teeth were exposed as he smiled wider. "Only know that I require it immediately." Slowly, he began to raise his fist from where it had rested at his side, and Anova saw that he was poised to snap his fingers. The guards at the edges of the room. Sweat slicked her back. Pale light caught on the edges of their blades as they crept. Though the shadows obscured their number, the fact that his guards were closing in on them was undeniable. Her heart froze in her chest. As if out of thin air, Malor was between them and the Fae King. Wisps of white smoke came from his clenched knuckles, and his head cocked to one side. A word escaped his pointed teeth. He cocked his head to lock gazes with her. "Finally." Malor crouched like an animal, and suddenly between his fingers were razor knives which looked to be coated in moonlight. She didn't want to find out what added property Malor had enchanted the knives with, but she feared she was about to find out. Before she could do anything, Leander pushed himself in front of her, knocking her against the ground. A snarl ripped from his lips, and his fists closed around some moonlight streaming inside. "Don't touch her," he said. Her stomach fell like a rusted anchor in the sea. He was going to fight them all. She had to do something. Adrenaline pummeled her insides. They'd made it so far that to die here, under the light of the bloated moon in a room full of drunken Fae, was too much a thought to bear. Trust. We need to prove our trust. But we have nothing to offer him. In her peripheral vision, Helmir watched them with a strange look on his face. Some compartment of her brain wondered what the others had had to do to prove their loyalty to him. What he'd sacrificed to appease this mad king. What Calix and Iona had given him. Not now. Anova suppressed the trembling that had started in her knees. She couldn't think about anything else now, not even her fear. Especially not her fear. One of Malor's knife blades had already hit him, and red dotted the floor. Leander threw it on the ground out of reach of the creature. Her heart shot into her throat. They couldn't even fight back properly without weapons. This wasn't going to work. It was time to do what she did best. The voice that came from her sounded like someone else's. It was the person she was pretending to be. As Anova took a step forward, she said to the mad Fae King before her, "To prove our loyalty, I'll be yours for the remainder of the night." Chapter 26. The sound of the High King's laugh was startling. Fae stopped what they were doing and stared at him. Anova was relieved to know that she wasn't the only one who thought him loose of a few nuts. Then again, she wondered if she was too. Malor stopped too suddenly, and he was back to being a statue glaring at her. In his hands were his razor knives, and he lowered them to his sides, but the look on his face told her that he'd been deprived. Leander backed away from him, his eyes still on the Fae, with one of his hands pressed hard against his arm where he bled. Leander breathed in her face. He'd spun her to face him, and his fingers had tilted her head up to look at him. She felt too dizzy and allowed the touch. After all, they were supposed to be lovers, weren't they? Everything was all wrong, but at least they weren't dead. "Anova," he said in something between a choke and a snarl. He was mad? Or scared? That couldn't be right. Either way, Anova couldn't believe it. She'd saved them, and this was how he was reacting. This was who she was, after all. This was who he'd hired. The pretender. Besides, dawn was an hour away. All she had to do was survive whatever came this hour. The quiet voice of reason inside her argued that she should have never made a bargain with such a Fae. That an hour was too long for a cruel Fae. It was a bargain that got me here in the first place. Anova blinked. She had to do something. As she moved his hands from her, she said to Leander, "I'll be back." She hoped he understood what she was saying, what she couldn't say in front of all these Fae. "I'm doing this to learn what I can about him, to infiltrate further than we could have hoped, to get us to our goals." The High King's voice interrupted her thoughts. He'd stopped laughing. "A human pet of my own." He appeared to give it some thought, though she knew he'd already decided. This seemed exactly the type of gesture that the mad Fae King relished. "I accept," the Fae King said. As she walked to where he'd sat once more upon his throne, panic started to crawl up her throat. What had she promised him? She would feel better if she knew with certainty. She felt the eyes of the Fae on her, but she didn't look to meet their stares. Anova kept her eyes straight before her for fear that she would stop before she got there. The closer she got, the more her head pounded out all her thoughts. Anova stopped before him. At a loss of what to do next, she started to bow to him, but the Fae King gestured her closer instead. "Please, sit." His incisors were long enough that they dug into his skin when he smiled like that. It was so wide that it looked like it hurt. The only problem with the command was that there was nowhere nearby to sit. Even his consorts, lazing on their lounges, were well out of earshot of them now. Anova swallowed, the emotions tangling inside her throat, and sat on the arm of the Fae throne. It was wide enough to seat her, though not particularly comfortable. The skin on the back of her neck raised. She could feel the High King's eyes on her, looking her over, appraising her. She was beginning to share Leander's desire to spill the blood from this Fae's throat. Anova swallowed down the desire. This was what they'd worked for. This was 1,000 times better of an opportunity than they've ever dreamed of having. Under the leaves of the tree, they were isolated from the others, though the eyes of all his court were on them. "Wolfsbane has quite the taste," he murmured next to her. Anova felt her teeth grinding together and promptly stopped. The Fae were too perceptive, and he might have noticed if she continued. Thank you, she managed in a low breath. Red crawled up her throat. She was balancing on top of the arm of the throne, though barely. The emotions in the faces of the Fae staring back at her ranged from incredulity to outright wrath. She did love making Fae angry, though this may be more enemies than we need. The High King spoke to her again. "This jacket is his, isn't it? Remove it." Her skin crawled. Fae bastard. There was nowhere to drape it, so she let it fall to the floor. Anova realized a second later who that had been for. Across the wide room from them, Leander was staring. He sat with Helmir, and she was sure that hadn't been his choice to make. Behind them were several of the king's guards, hovering, waiting. Malor had moved to the king's side once more, but she didn't doubt for a second that he wasn't watching Leander as well. The High King is trying to bait Leander into doing something. This wasn't about her. The mad Fae King laughed darkly. Leander is showing his desire to spill my throat. How delicious. Anova felt herself stiffen despite her better instincts. She had to be very careful how she reacted to that. Not that I can't understand his possessiveness, the High King continued. Possessiveness? Anova swallowed. Your command on him is clear to any beast with eyes, the Fae King said. Anova wanted to shake her head at that, but she stopped herself. For the roles they were playing, it was best others thought they saw that. But Leander was her employer, accomplice at most. He had no such feelings for her, and Anova didn't delude herself into thinking that he did. What they had was a begrudging respect for one another, like the esteem one held for one's enemy. Even if she was only one of two people who knew the Fae he really was. She swallowed. At least, should Leander betray her in the last hour, she had collateral on him. She was sure he couldn't say the same for her. And that was how she preferred things. Her thoughts were wrested from her when the High King addressed the Fae before him in a voice that filled the cavernous space. While the moon is still risen, I owe you the reason for our sub rosa revelry. The King of the Fae leaned forward in his throne, one of his hands beside her thigh as he rested them on the throne's arms. The invasion into the human lands will begin in 2 weeks. We will take our best before more of them infiltrate our borders. Anova stilled. The mad Fae King leaned back and gestured to Anova perched on the throne's armrest. The evidence of how easy it is for them. Well, it's right before you. She didn't breathe. She didn't think she could. The next moments passed in a blur for her. She thought she'd started trembling, though not out of fear. It had been a trap. All of it, even starting with their invitation here. That their debut in his court had been tonight, there was no coincidence. Only crafty Fae traps. And they'd strolled right into one. What a fool she'd been. Invasion. He's going to invade Urbess. Her thoughts spiraled out of her control. She knew she should have worried more about what was going on around her, but she couldn't find the will to care at the moment. The monsters in this room were about to descend upon her home. Looking at them, she knew they would kill the people of Urbess. They would rip them apart, limb from limb, if only for the delight of it. Anova's head was dizzy. She was about to lose everything she'd ever had. Somewhere, a woman started to scream. Chapter 27. Distantly, Anova heard the sound of a woman screaming. A human woman. A scream she'd heard before. A silent gasp caught in her throat like a bird trapped in a silken spiderweb. invisible to the eye until the last second. Had the bastards caught one of her own already? Sweat ran into her eyes, obscuring her vision. She jerked, looking around for the woman. Where was she? Her heart thundered too hard in her chest. Anova couldn't breathe fast enough. She needed to find her. She needed to save her. A hand was on her arm. An unfamiliar Fae one. Anova yanked her arm away. They wouldn't take her too. They'd taken her mother already, and they were going to take her too. Where was the human? You need to calm yourself, hissed a voice in her ear. It was a female Fae's voice, one she didn't know. Anova's eyes felt like they were rolling like marbles in her head as she tried to grasp what was going on. She wasn't on the throne anymore. Somehow she was away from the High King. Her breathing still came fast, too fast for her to catch up to it. She still wasn't safe. She was still in Fae. Anova tried to stand, but her legs had other intentions. She fell back, her elbows buried in cushions. For the first time, she started to notice where she was. She was still in the room with the tree and the window to the moon above. Judging from the angle of the shadows draping the room, no more than a handful of minutes had passed since she'd been on the throne next to the king of the Fae. Leander was nowhere to be seen. Anova stifled the fear that rose up in her throat from that fact. She wasn't alone. Sitting next to her on a cushioned lounge pushed towards the edge of the room was a beautiful Fae. Her sharp ears parted strands of dark hair the color of night, and her eyes were yellow and cunning like a predatory bird's. Silken clothes hung to her form, and golden earrings dangled from the outer cartilage of her ears. What happened? Where is Leander? Anova stopped herself from blurting more. There were too many questions to get them all out. One of the Fae's dark eyebrows arched high on her face. Though I know not what civilities humans claim, the creatures I know exchange such things as names and shows of gratitude before making demands of each other. Anova bit down against her teeth. She was thoroughly failing as a spy thus far and painfully aware of that fact. But what did she owe this Fae? What did she owe any of them? In 2 weeks' time, they would be slitting the throats of humans like her. Juris's throat. She realized that moment who this was. Anova looked to the other lounges spread out near them and the gorgeous Fae perched on them. You're one of the king's consorts. Perceptive of you. The Fae's eyebrows lowered. My name is Lotharia, human. I've already gathered yours. Lotharia, Anova repeated. She looked to the rest of the room before them. She felt separated from them, the dancing and reveling Fae drunk on sips of moonlight. They celebrated her people's downfall. Her voice felt too tight when she added, What happened after his proclamation? I don't remember it clearly. Her skin felt prickly and sensitive. She didn't relish admitting such a vulnerability to a Fae, especially one she didn't know the intentions of. Your disorientation is obvious. Anova bit the inside of her lip. Lotharia watched the mass of dancing bodies before them, and Anova wondered what kind of Fae she was. What kind of Fae did such a mad king take as a consort? Not one this serious, she considered. After you started attacking the Fae around you, I took you from him, Lotharia said. Her eyes were like jewels as they glanced over at her. You're lucky. He could have decided that you were trying in earnest to kill him. Anova sank back into the cushions they shared. She didn't remember that. All she remembered was, Where's the other human? The woman? Anova started looking for her, but everywhere she looked, Fae bodies jostled as they thrashed and drank from the moon. She wasn't sure if she was relieved not to see her, though. Lotharia stared back at her, her face impassive. There is no other human here. The realization dawned on Anova, and she held herself tight like she could hold together her broken pieces. It had all been in her mind. Memories that she'd tried to bury. She needed to get out of here. She needed to find Leander and leave this terrible place. Breaths shuddered through her. Stop this. I've been through worse to fall apart here. She took one more long breath that dragged through her. I can't let these monsters win. Where is Leander? She asked when she had the breath to speak again. Lotharia watched the crowd of Fae carefully as she answered. Your mate is with the other one, the dark one. The phrase, her mate, made her heart jump. That's what these people think we are, she remembered. Those are the roles we're playing. Instead of reacting to those words, she said under her breath, Helmir. She wasn't sure it was a good sign that Leander was with him. It could mean a variety of things. It could mean that their mission had been compromised. But why would the Fae King leave me then? She had to believe that they were both still safe. To think otherwise would drive her mad. Besides, she still had a job to do here. When she mentioned Helmir, Lotharia's eyes flicked to her face and back to the crowd again. Anova pursed her lips. Could she trust this Fae? It was a laughable question. Perhaps the better one was, did she have any other choice? The words were out of her mouth in a low whisper before she could decide against saying them. I need to know something about the High King, something perhaps only a Fae like you would know. Lotharia leaned back against the gentle slope of the wide lounge chair that was more like a bed than a chair. She picked up a golden pear on a plate near her that was the color of her eyes and examined it. Those are dangerous words, even more so for a human whose loyalty to his majesty is so loosely proven. Anova said, and if you had the intention of watching me die by his hand for the barest of suspicions, you wouldn't have interfered. Lotharia's strange eyes pendulated from the pair before her to Anova. For the first time since they'd met, something like a smirk sprang to the consort's lips. Well, the human girl knows how to parry her words well. The smirk fell from her lips as quickly as it had appeared. All things have a price in this world, including information. Name yours. Lotharia looked upon her, seeming to decide something. Finally, she said, The one with your mate, Helmir. Tell me what you know of him. Anova tried hard to keep the surprise from her face. What did Lotharia want of that bastard? She considered everything she knew of him. If I want to buy quality information, I can't hold back. Anova used Lotharia's technique and pulled from the plate on the low table before them a green apple. She appeared to consider it for a length of time before taking a bite. If she wanted to ensure no Fae were reading her lips from the other side of the room, she had to be discreet. Between chews, she said in a low voice, Helmir was recently promoted to the King's Guard, which you may already know. I've gathered that he and Leander used to be friends, though something happened to change that some years ago. Anova swallowed the piece of apple. Lotharia looked bored as she inspected the piece of roasted meat on a stick before her. Anova knew it was an act. It was in the way she held her shoulders, and in the way her head was tilted slightly towards Anova to better hear her. Anova continued, As a Fae, he is devious, cruel. I imagine that applies to most of your kind. However, out of our many enemies, I suspect he is one of the most dangerous of them. Second to the king himself, in fact. She knew she should have been more concerned with calling the High King one of her enemies, though she was starting to suspect that he was one of Lotharia's as well. It would be rash to consider us on the same side, however, she reminded herself. After all, a distaste for the Fae King didn't mean that his consort was planning to kill him as Anova was. Lotharia appeared as bored as before, but Anova knew better. Something had flashed across the Fae's face before the consort could smother it in herself. Had it been resignation? Satisfaction? Anova couldn't decide. Very well, And the house he hails from? She asked. Anova hid her surprise better this time. Why did Lotharia want to know of Helmir's family? I know not, Anova admitted with a frown. Then that is the extent of the information you have to trade, Lotharia remarked. What is the information you seek in return? Anova breathed in and out. Now that she was so close to knowing, it was a heady feeling. She peeked at the throne. The High King wasn't looking this way, but he wasn't the only Fae who could have been eavesdropping. Anova spoke quietly. I need to know more about his consorts. I need to know if he ever had a human lover. Lotharia's response was quick and resolute. No, not that I've ever seen. Her eyes flashed to Anova's face. Are you hoping to be his first? Her gut twisted at the thought of that. She'd sooner vomit on him. No, she settled on. I just need to know. She was aware of the waters she was treading now, but it was too late to step back from the question. Anova breathed and started again. Does the High King ever go into the lands of my people? It would have been just a few years past. Lotharia appeared to weigh her answer before speaking. The Fae you know to be king is a hardened paranoid. He almost never leaves this palace now. His appearances at the moon celebrations have dwindled. Even when he launches his attack on your people, he is unlikely to be much involved himself, until perhaps the last hour when victory is assured. At her mention of the attack on her people, Anova felt nauseous. It hasn't happened yet. It hasn't happened yet. Anova stared at the Fae King in question. A servant stood at his side, tilting the goblet of wine while he drank liberally. Before him, one of his other consorts danced, removing more and more pieces of her clothing. Anova couldn't help herself. Is it all a front? She asked. The revelry, the base pleasures, the hedonism? You're wondering how he can be both. Lotharia's chin rested on part of her knuckles. It also served to conveniently conceal her mouth as she spoke. As a lover, he is unlike ones I had before. Lotharia's gaze went to Anova's face when she added, I'm sure you noticed he never touched you. Anova's mouth parted slightly before she could help it. He doesn't want to be touched himself. Very good, Lotharia murmured. You seem to know well of intimate matters for your age. Were you married in your lands before he took you? Anova flinched at the implication that Leander had stolen her. No, Anova admitted in shock. Lotharia was perceptive. My mother worked in a brothel. She broke her stare to look out on the room of madness before her. One learns things. Yes, one would, Lotharia agreed. She's made the connection. She knows why I asked about the High King's lovers, Anova realized with a frown. This Fae had seen far too much of her. I would ask that what we've spoken on doesn't leave your lips again, Anova said in a tight voice. At that, Lotharia turned to look at her fully. Something like a low laugh escaped her lips. There is enough between us now to damn the other completely. The Fae's eyes sparkled dangerously. So, you will never speak of this to anyone either, unless your head aches to be on one of his spikes. Not yet, Anova said through pursed lips. But she was right. They'd spoken of matters concerning the High King too freely. At times, traitorously. What was more, his consort now knew more about her than Leander did. Not that she intended to tell him any of this. Lotharia looked to the domed window facing the heavens above them. Dawn is breaking. You should go, unless you wish to become a more permanent part of his court. Anova got up and was relieved to find her legs steady. She turned towards her. Thank you didn't feel right. but she owed her something regardless. "May I see you again?" Anova paused, considering whether or not to add more. But Lotharia was right. If one of them spoke the secrets of the other, they would doom them both. Perhaps under different circumstances. "Perhaps you will. Farewell, human child," Lotharia said. As she spoke, her yellow eyes went to the far end of the room where there was an archway leading elsewhere. Anova gave her silent thanks for the directions and departed from her side. Under the cover of fleeting shadows, she left the room of monsters that danced for her downfall. Chapter 28. Anova's breath came fast and hard. Where is he? Now that dawn was upon them and she still hadn't found him, the panic started to swell within her like a bloated body down the river. Her gasps came harder. Guards lined the halls as she rushed past. Had one of them already killed him? Or had it been Malor? She hadn't seen him in the dining hall after she'd collapsed. She didn't wish to consider it, but she had to. It was time to get Viridia and get out, or she ran the risk of not getting out at all. The High King's guards watched as she rushed through the first doors she found leading outside. Cold nipped at her skin immediately. She shivered and regretted not going back to find his jacket, but she couldn't go back inside that place. She wasn't sure that none of them had followed her. The world was silent, and dawn had started to blush the edge of the sky. She drew in sharp breaths of winter air and held herself tight for warmth. As she slogged through the pile of snow, a form emerged from the trees. Anova bit down a sob. It was Viridia. Her magic is nearly spent. The butterfly steed's size was half what it had been when they'd landed. Her delicate legs speared the snow as she came closer. I have to leave now or not at all. Anova repeated the phrase in her head as she forced her limbs to move. She climbed atop her steed's back as her chest heaved. I have to leave now or not at all. Dawn was spilling across the sky, but she didn't move. Anova cursed herself and the beating heart that was twisted up inside of her. Why did she have to be this way? Anova dismounted Viridia and whispered in her ear for her to stay. However, she wasn't sure that she wouldn't find a mere butterfly in the snow when she came back to her. He'd better be dead or dying. But part of her was afraid that that was exactly what was happening. A sound pierced the stillness, and Anova turned towards it. It had come from the other side of the wall of evergreen trees on the castle grounds. She pushed past the trees and left behind Viridia. The sounds grew in volume among the evergreens, and her pulse pounded inside her. The more she listened, the more she suspected. It was a fight that she was hearing. She heard their voices seconds later.
What did he give you?
Leander's voice was strident in the cold air. He inhaled sharply.
What was it?
Anova moved so that she could see past the last of the trees without revealing herself. Of course, she couldn't do anything about their preternatural sense of smell or hearing. Within the clearing beyond the evergreen trees, the two Fae circled each other. It was Leander and Helmir. One of Helmir's eyes had been struck. A dark bruise had already spread from the impact. She held her breath as she assessed Leander. Some of his clothes had been torn, and there was a concerning gash along his cheek, but he seemed to be faring just as well as Helmir. She didn't breathe as she watched Helmir, waiting for him to turn so she could see if he still possessed his blade. The Fae's laugh startled some crows in the tree above her.
My old friend, you've already seen it, Helmir said. Prestige, power, access.
Leander's lips curled back in a snarl that made the hairs on the back of her neck raise. His voice wasn't as loud as Helmir's was, but it was somehow more threatening.
Is that what this is worth, Hel?
He held himself like an animal about to strike. There must have been something in the way he'd said it because Helmir stopped circling him, just for a moment. It was enough of a pause that allowed Leander to strike. The punch threw Helmir's head back, and as fast as lightning, he retaliated. The Fae grabbed Leander's wrist and twisted back Leander's arm until he was over him.
Maybe, Helmir hissed to him. Maybe it was.
Out of nowhere, a blade gleamed in the light of the new day. Anova's heart throbbed in her chest. Helmir held the blade against Leander's throat.
I always was the better fighter than you, Leander, Helmir said softly. If only your brother were here instead of you.
Instead of drawing it across his throat, Helmir's knee found Leander's back, and he kicked him to the ground. Too quickly, Leander was facing him again from where he'd stumbled on the ground, his throat bleeding from a nick and his face more terrifying than she'd ever seen it.
Leander's going to try to kill him if I don't stop them.
Leander! Anova's voice was too loud in the cold stillness of the morning. She stumbled out of the trees. The faces of the Fae whipped around to see her. Something in Leander's expression made her stomach tighten strangely.
Looks like your pet is yours again, Helmir said.
He got 2 steps towards her before Leander was between them. His back pressed into her, and she was assaulted by his sage and woodland smell.
The night is over, Leander said. Go back to your master.
Helmir smirked at her past Leander, though she felt that it might have been forced.
I'll see you next time, Anova.
I hope not, she muttered, though he was gone. Leander spun to see her. His smell was making her dizzy again, or perhaps it was just everything that had happened to her in the last 24 hours.
Are you okay?
Leander's eyes gleamed with hatred as he asked.
Did he touch you?
Words stuck in her throat. There was too much to say. Too much had happened between them and to them. Instead of trying to construct a response to that, she shook her head. It was enough of an answer to both questions.
Day is dawning, he said. We need to be gone from this place.
Anova couldn't agree more. As they ran through the evergreens, she said in breaths, Viridia is nearby. I don't know if... She didn't have to complete her thought. Their steed was hardly larger than a dog. She flapped her wings and hovered in the air, more an insect than mount now. Anova looked down. Her dress had transformed into her black burglar's clothes from before. We're out of time, Anova said in a choked voice. But even if they had to walk, she would get out of here. Leander shook his head.
Almost.
Only a suggestion of stars remained in the heavens above, but it must have been enough. Leander opened his hand, and some dribbles of Fae magic fell into his palm. It wasn't nearly as much as last time, but she hoped it would be enough. Viridia, the size of a bird now, perched on his hand and extended her tongue. Above them, daylight speared the gray sky in furious oranges and yellows. Her stomach was balled up. There was no way this was going to work. Will the High King let us back through the front gates? She wondered out loud. She regretted asking it almost immediately from the look on his face. She didn't want to chance it either.
We just need to get past the walls,
Leander said, though his voice was tight.
After that, I'll arrange for transportation in the nearest town.
Anova didn't say anything. She stepped back and watched as Viridia grew again. Her pulse raced. When her limbs were done extending, she wasn't as big as she should have been, but she was big enough for the two of them. She slid on top of Viridia and in front of Leander. She held tight to the butterfly steed as they took to the air. Daylight streaked across the heavens behind them. They made it beyond his walls, though barely so. Chapter 29.
Eat something, Leander murmured to her. You'll feel better.
I feel fine, Anova said, though she took a ladleful of creamy soup anyway. He didn't have to point out her lie for both of them to know it. The same day that they'd arrived back at the Wolfsbane estate from the High King's revelry, they'd attempted to send word to Urbess of what was coming for them. That wasn't possible. She couldn't go back to Urbess anymore, or even send a message out. The boundary forests were teeming with his guards. And on the night of the full moon, she'd realized something. She had to do it. She had to be the one who killed the High King. Not only for Leander anymore, or even for the riches he'd promised her, but for her entire people. It was a prospect that wasn't sitting particularly well with her. Additionally, she was back to where she'd started concerning her mother's murderer. Less than 2 weeks.
Eat something.
Leander was still watching her from across the table overladen with food. I am, she said, picking up the spoon to her soup.
No,
he interrupted. He sounded pissed off. What did he have to be pissed off about? Her kind wasn't planning to annihilate his anytime soon.
You're hardly eating anything again.
She narrowed her eyes at him. Again? What are you talking about? Leander looked at her for several seconds as if he were debating saying something.
You look better now.
His eyes flew away from her face, and his arms crossed in front of his chest.
When you're eating, that is.
Anova opened her mouth and closed it again. She knew her meals had been scarce in Urbess, but she didn't look that different, did she? She looked down at her lap and shook her head to herself. She wasn't sure what the Fae was talking about, though she supposed she could appease him. The smell of thyme filled her, and she ate her fill of the soup. When they were done with their meal, they lingered at the dining table. She couldn't bring herself to get up and go back to training. Anova didn't know what made her say it, but in that moment, she felt she had to say it out loud. I have to do it, she said. I have to be the one. There were no other humans in Fae that she knew of, and only a human could break the line of corrupt Fae kings and queens. Only a human could break the blood crown.
We're going to do it together,
Leander promised. It wasn't just a promise to her, but to the slaughterer of his family. Anova closed her eyes. She couldn't quite handle when he looked at her like that, anyway. Her voice was flat. How are we going to do this? How are we going to kill the most powerful Fae here? Leander licked his lips.
I've been working on something.
Now that she'd seen what went on inside his stronghold, and the monstrosity of a structure itself, she had realized the scope of the problem before them. We can't do it inside his castle, can we? Anova said. It was where she'd always envisioned spilling the guts of the Fae King. But there was no way they could even smuggle a sharp hair accessory inside that place. He shook his head.
Correct.
The heir to the Wolfsbane family name stood suddenly and started to pace the room.
He has far too much control in his own domain. Other than his army of king's guards, the walls outside his castle are too high to scale. So, why does the Fae King leave his stronghold at all? He asked her.
Anova considered the question. She remembered what Lotharia had said about him. The Fae you know to be king is a hardened paranoid. He almost never leaves this place now. His appearances at the moon celebrations have dwindled. It all comes back to the duality of his nature. Why is he like this? She thought she was beginning to understand the Fae King better. He wants to experience what he can't inside the walls of his stronghold, Anova ventured. Danger, excitement, and other Fae killing themselves for a chance for the moon to shine on them.
Very good,
Leander said from across the room.
That's likely why. I've suspected for some time that absolute power has started to bore him. However,
he said, turning to face her,
the Fae King rarely celebrates the waning of the moon. It's a bit taboo.
Anova's throat felt like it was closing around itself. The math was clear. But the moon will be waning for another 2 weeks, she said between her teeth. Something else occurred to her then. He's planning to attack without the power of the moon, she said, and her eyebrows pushed together.
"That's right," Leander said. "I thought about that too. The only explanation that makes sense to me is that he's going to use the darkness as a cover. It's going to be at night."
"They're going to murder them in their beds while they sleep." Anova shot to her feet. "How do we get him out of the castle before then?"
"Isn't that the question?"
He'd said it as if to himself. Leander glanced at her.
"We'll have to lure him out ourselves."
Anova's lips pressed together. Above all, the Fae King loved a party, but this couldn't be just any party either. "If not for the moon, why else do your kind gather and drink themselves to death?" she asked. "We would need a compelling reason for the King of Fae to leave his stronghold." For some reason, her question caused Leander's gaze to shift from her. He moved to the wide window ledge dominating one wall of the room and leaned into it. She took a step towards him. "What is it?" she said.
"It's nothing. I'll have to develop the plan more,"
Leander said, though his eyes still weren't on her. She stared at him and got the feeling that he'd already developed his plan. Without her. Anova took another step. "Tell me," she said. "Or else." Leander turned then, too fast for her to step back from him. His pouty Fae lips were twisted into a smirk. She wanted to wipe it off his face.
"What's wrong, Anova?"
She grinded her teeth. She felt like this was a distraction, and she hated that it was working. "Nothing at all," she said in a falsely sweet voice. His smell was starting to fill her like flower-perfumed air.
"Liar,"
he said. His finger found her chin, and he lifted her face up to look at him.
"You were really trying to rob me this whole time, weren't you?"
He made it seem like burglary was cute. "I would have gotten away with it. Besides," she said, "Fae are supposed to be rich. I was just helping myself to my share."
"And humans are supposed to be scared of us. But I don't think you are,"
he said. As he turned from her, he said,
"By the way, Nerium has been investigating a matter for me. It's something that may help us, though we can't assume it will."
Anova's heart lodged inside her throat. Any advantage was better than none. "What is it?"
"It's the book Lycasta brought here," Leander said. "It is the one we were looking for, but it's been rewritten in code. Nerium has been deciphering it."
"And it's about the blood crown?" Anova asked.
"Possibly. It's a book of fables. He thinks one of them refers to an ancient Fae artifact."
Leander paused his pacing. With his back still to her, he said,
"It's something my brother would have been able to do in a night."
Anova stilled. He'd never talked about him so openly. Leander, his dead brother. The lover of ancient lore. She realized something else, too. Her chest felt tight. "When she gave you that, she thought..." Leander's face was carefully blank and his voice even as he spoke.
"She loved my brother from a young age. Who he was, the scholar, always appealed to her."
This was why he never acted on it, she thought. She's in love with someone who died years ago. It was almost too cruel to consider. As he was about to leave the room, she managed through tight lips. "I'm sorry." She was surprised to find that she meant it. Leander shook his head, though he didn't turn around to look at her.
"Don't be. I thought it would be worse. But all I can feel now is relief that someone else knows this damned truth."
Anova couldn't move. It sounded like only the second true thing he'd ever said to her. Second to the truth of who he really was. It terrified her. Chapter 30. Anova dodged another one of Leander's blows with the dagger in her hand. Since their discussion a day ago, She'd trained nearly an entire 24 hours. After stopping to sleep for a few hours, she'd snuck back into his training area only to find him there. Her instincts were almost as good as a Fae's, but she had to do better than them in every possible way. Craftier, stronger, and more willing to fight to the death.
Good, Leander said as he twisted out of the way in the last second. Faster!
Anova's breath hitched, but she moved across from him again. They'd stopped sparring with proper rules and form and started fighting like she remembered doing so when she'd grown up. No rules. To the death, or as close as your opponent was willing to go. Her knife dove for his side, but he was out of the way before it got close. Her teeth gnashed together.
Go faster,
Leander bade, a blur in front of her face.
I know you can.
Anova didn't respond with words. She followed him like his shadow and threw a kick to his side that would break a rib if it hit right. He was out of the way with time to spare.
I'm going as fast as I can,
she said, her voice too strident.
You're not.
Anova wanted to kick him to the ground more than she wanted anything in that moment. Her blade came for him in a lightning-fast swing, but he deflected it with his own. Air rushed in and out of her with a fury. She was supposed to be the one with nothing to lose here, but she was still losing. She was the one with the fate of an entire people on her back. Didn't the universe understand that he could afford to fail, but she couldn't? But no matter how hard she tried, they were better from the start. No, I'll never believe that. Aches and scratches across her body screamed for her attention, but she ignored them. If he could continue, then so could she. But in her heart, she knew she would either bend or break if she persisted in this. She had to end their fight. She had to prove that she could do this. The more she thought on it, the more her blood thundered through her with the need. She was tired of the assumed superiority. She was tired of the secrets he held from her. The plan unfurled in her mind like a blooming flower, beautiful and layered. If she couldn't be faster, then she would be more cunning. If she couldn't be better, she would cheat. Her body knew what to do better than her mind did. Anova focused on the weapon in his hand. There was more than one way to win an advantage over an opponent, but one of the easiest ways was to disarm them. She gave him an opening. Let him think what he already knows, that he's the faster one. The edge of his knife cut into her collarbone, but it brought him close enough for her to act. As he passed before her, she whispered to him, "They thought you stole me. Your friends." It worked. Leander faltered before pulling back as he realized what she'd said. In a blur, she jerked the blade from his grip and crossed both of them tight under his throat. Her gut twisted that she'd had to best him in this way, and that it had worked. That the opinions of his rotten friends still had such sway on him. You have to use every advantage at your hands. "I've won," she announced. She shifted closer to him and breathed in his ear. "Tell me all of your plan. I know there's more." Leander was silent except for the audible grinding of his teeth. "Unless you wish me to spill your blood instead, Fae." This was ridiculous. If there was more to this plan, he needed to share it with her. This involved both of them. "The only reason he would leave his castle before the assault is for a spectacle of considerable magnitude. It would have to be a spectacle important or rare enough that he couldn't dare miss it," Leander said through his teeth as she held him in her vice. "It's simple." Her heart thrashed in her chest, but she asked anyway. "And that would be?" Each word fell from his lips like drops of rainwater in the desert, short and fleeting. "A Fae human wedding." Anova's limbs stopped working. Her mind stopped processing words, but he continued to speak anyway. "Unless you wish to hold an execution instead." She managed to hold the blades at his throat even while the strength fled her knees. His dark lashes brushed against his skin as he looked at her from the angle that she held his head back at. "Which is it that you want, Anova?" There was something about his voice that made her want to shiver, but she suppressed the urge. When he spoke, there was a tightly controlled emotion there, but she felt that it was just under the surface. Words? She should have been saying some by now. Despite her superior position, sweat beaded at her forehead. A fake Fae human wedding, she said, and it was somehow both an answer and question.
As fake as the rest of this has been,
he said. She was at once too aware of his body pressed against the front of hers. Her heart throbbed, giving her away.
I thought I told you to lie better,
he said, breathing on her. I'm not lying. She felt too dizzy.
Is that so?
In a blur of movement, he'd turned in her grip. His hands wound around her wrists and forced them above her head faster than she could react. He leaned closer to her ear, his breath tickling her.
When they ask, I want you to tell them that I'm a monster.
As he said it, his thumb pressed into the cut along her collarbone that she'd forgotten.
I want you to tell them you're doomed to me.
Chapter 31. Their bodies were like paintings in motion. A blur of color flashed before her, and shadow moved as if to accommodate them. They were always moving. Anova studied the Fae before her. Each was armed with one of their short blades. They'd hardly touched each other. Nerium was the clear veteran, though how a Fae could have experience with weapons when they'd been outlawed for years escaped her. However, Leander was faster. He was the one she was rooting for. Not that she was going to let them know that. She studied them, waiting for one of them to show a vulnerability, an opening, anything. There was nothing. How am I going to best a Fae when they fight like this? It was like a dance. Leander would dodge one of Nerium's strikes, those quick and brutal stabs that she wondered if she would be able to dodge. Leander would start it again by feinting to one side as he aimed for Nerium's opposite side. Anova swallowed. But that was it, wasn't it? This was why they were drawing him out, to hold the knife at the Fae King's back rather than before him, because there was no chance that they could best his army of Fae soldiers. She shifted, confronted with an uncomfortable fact. All this sparring practice was really just so that she could fight her way out of the repercussions. Stabbing a Fae King was one task. Fighting off the onslaught of his followers to tell the tale afterward was another entirely. She went back to the problem at her fingers. Anova sat in a plush chair pushed against a table with books and papers spread across it. On a slip of paper was the outline of a flowing dress. When they'd shared their plan with him, Nerium had designed the dress in less than an hour. There were 4 separate compartments fit to hide either a small blade or a vial of poison. Her kind of dress. It's going to be my wedding dress, she reminded herself, though she cringed from the word. Marriage to a Fae? She should have poisoned herself before considering such a thing. Only the assurance that it was fake calmed her. They hadn't yet announced it to Fae and the world at large. Juris would hatch a chicken if he heard. They had a week to plan it, and she hadn't yet gotten used to the word marriage yet. Her stomach bubbled with nausea. It won't be real. I'd take the poisoned dagger to my own throat if it was. Directly before her was the ancient text that Nerium claimed had been written in a code. However, to her, it seemed exactly what it was. A book of Fae tales written in a style of runes older than her great-great-grandmother. Her eyes ached in their sockets as her fingers grazed the soft paper. Had this really been the book she'd found in the archives that night? Lycasta must have found out that Leander wanted it. Something stirred in her stomach as she thought on it more. Had she been spying on them for even longer than they'd realized? Her eyes went to the ceiling of Leander's study, but she saw no moths. Anova returned to the Fae tales before her. Most of them seemed like they'd been thought up just to scare little Fae children. Her hand paused after she turned to the next fable. The runes for human and Fae stood out to her. Suddenly, those words had much more meaning to her than they once had. She bit down on the inside of her lip and snuck a peek at the two sparring Fae. Clearly, neither of them had looked over at her since they'd started. Anova pulled the text closer to her, careful not to tear the relic that was its binding. A second later, she grabbed another, much newer book from the corner of the table, titled A Comprehensive History of the Written Fae Rune. As she worked, she started to piece together a story in the Book of Fables. In a time when Fae and humans lived peaceably among each other, a human boy fell in love with a Fae princess. However, she was promised to the son of a powerful Fae lord and forbidden from seeing the human. One night, the distraught Fae princess left her castle, carrying a lantern with which to see through the shadows and darkness. Great, dark forests surrounded the castle on all sides that hindered intruders and attacks on the Fae royals. Though she found she could go no farther for guilt of upsetting her father in case she could not find her way back, all was not in vain. Lovesick, the human boy had been wandering through the dark forests without moon or light to see by. He followed the light of her lantern, and they came together. Every night thereafter, the Fae princess led her human lover to her by the light of her lantern, and they met under the darkness of the forests. One night, the Fae king discovered the treachery of his daughter. As darkness started to spread across the lands once more, he filled the windows of her rooms with sunlight. The Fae princess stayed in her rooms, eager to sleep away more daylight hours to be rested enough for a tryst in the night. The Fae king took his daughter's lantern as the Vesper star streaked across the sky, leading it from the castle through the great forests around it. In the darkness of the night, the human boy followed the light of the Fae king. The king stood on the other side of a great chasm. Trusting his Fae lover, the human boy fell to his death. Anova shut the book of Fae tales. There was a page or two more to the story, but her eyes ached from the old runes. She frowned. That was what she'd told herself, but perhaps the truth was that her appetite for tragedies was low these days. There was too much of it in the real world at the moment. As she was about to pull the Book of Fables to her again despite herself, the two Fae stopped in the middle of their sparring. Both their heads turned in the same direction. Anova twisted to look where they were, but she saw nothing. That wasn't good. Leander was beside her in a second. In a single sweep of his arm, he collected all the papers and books spread across her desk and shoved them into a drawer. "What's going on?" she asked. She looked beyond Leander to see what Miriam was doing, but he was gone. "We have a visitor," he said through tight lips. She forced the word from her throat. "Who?" "I don't know yet." Apparently satisfied that he'd hidden their plans to assassinate the king well enough, Leander stalked to the door of his study. Anova bolted out of her chair and followed. He spun on his feet. "You're not coming. Stay here." "I'm not staying," she said, crossing her arms over her chest. She was perfectly aware that she painted the perfect picture of a headstrong child, but she couldn't relent. Leander stepped closer to her. "We don't have time for this, Anova." "I'm not staying," she repeated. Not after last time. Not after that." Anova bit down on her tongue. She'd meant to make a much more convincing argument than that, but she couldn't rephrase it now. "I'm not staying in the shadows while Lycasta manipulates you against me." But instead of laughing at her childish reasoning or shutting the door in her face, Leander was looking at her with a strange expression. She wished he'd shut the door in her face instead. "All right, just stay by my side. Whoever it is, they're at the door now." They flew through the Wolfsbane estate until they came to the wide entry hall. Miriam was there already and in fresh clothes that he couldn't have had time to change into. The Fae manservant's hand rested on the ornate handle of the door. Leander nodded, once, and Nerium opened the door. The Fae on the other side stepped in and said in a breath, "Leander!" Her hair spilled around her shoulders, and her face was streaked with red like she'd been crying. To her shock, Anova realized that she had been. It was the first time she'd ever seen a Fae cry. Iona stepped inside fully, and neither of the other two Fae prohibited her. Her voice broke around the words. "He's done it. He's killed my brother." Anova watched in horror as the enemy Fae was admitted with no fuss, or even a sideways glance at the sheathed weapon at her hip. But Leander was stiff and pale. His eyes were hard as they looked on her.
"You're going to have to explain more than that."
"You know." Iona's voice didn't falter now. "Don't pretend otherwise. You knew Calix was my twin brother." Leander was silent. Anova spoke despite herself. "What?" Iona spoke as if Leander had been the one to address her. "Our mother separated us at birth to protect us from him. I thought you, out of all people, might suspect." Iona shook her head. "No, it doesn't matter. But Leander, he found out." She stepped closer to him, closer than Anova would have liked any Fae to get, and said, "We told no one." Leander's face was hard.
"Was this why you joined his forces?"
"He never explicitly threatened one of us, though the both of us suspected," Iona said. "We thought this could be his way of permitting it." He shook his head.
"There is no permitting anything when it comes to him. Not really."
As Leander spoke, he and Anova shared a brief glance. If the king was cleaning his closets, they had to assume he was coming for him next. Iona said, "You must hide me. He'll kill me for allowing this to happen. I came to you because I knew you would help, that you'd understand." Anova's heart lurched. Somehow, she preferred the version of her that made threats rather than the Fae who begged for help. If she knew how well he understood. Anova stared at Iona. But perhaps she does. Leander stopped her from saying more.
"I can't hide you. You know that. It would only draw unnecessary suspicion to us all, and potentially get us killed should he decide we're hiding from him."
"He's like a cat," Anova realized. Only such a creature would be more eager to continue the chase if it saw its prey scurry to hide. Iona didn't relent. Her hands found his arms. "I know you can hide me." Leander's teeth came together.
"I don't know what you're talking about."
His eyes flicked from the Fae in his face to Anova and Nerium and back to Iona.
"Why don't you sit at my table? Nerium will make tea."
Iona looked at the three of them, finally acknowledging Nerium and Anova before settling her gaze on Leander again. After a moment, she said, No, I have some affairs to sort out now that he's dead. I think I'll attend to them." Anova's stomach roiled. She couldn't claim him as her twin, not even in his death. No matter how much she despised the Fae who were Leander's former friends, she couldn't help but feel something like pity for her then. Leander took a step after her. Just one.
"Why did Hell join? What did he give him?"
Iona looked over her shoulder, her hand hovering over the door handle. "He never told us, just as we didn't tell him why." She was about to leave in earnest when she stopped, her face not looking at them this time. Though we all joined him at the same time. Chapter 32. Anova's feet slammed against the cobblestones. The cold infiltrated her bones and tried to slow her as her breath puffed in front of her face. She was 12 again, and her legs were far too short. Madame Hinterfell's voice bounced across the walls surrounding her. "You can't run forever, Anova." But that was where she was wrong. To get away from her, she could run forever. She slipped beyond the shadows, even if she couldn't slip away from the chill invading the air. Her body slammed into a pile of trash in a building's alley, her clothes silencing the blow as she tucked herself behind it. Her lungs screamed for her to gulp air down, but she couldn't give her position away with loud breathing. Mother is gone. She's not coming back. It was as if she could convince herself that the words were real if she repeated them enough. Her mother was gone, and there was no one left in the world to protect her from Hinterfell. Her teeth chattered in her head. She says I owe her. For everything. For our room, our food, even our clothes. But then where had the money gone that her mother had made? Anova had a sneaking suspicion. Mother owed her as well. And Anova would die owing Madame Hinterfell too. It was then that a bottle crashed against her head, and pain split her vision. She sank to the cold ground, alone. Anova! Anova! Madame Hinterfell's voice transformed into one entirely different. Her eyelids opened, and it took her too long to realize where she was. Darkness had draped her room. Her chest heaved, and sweat had soaked into her back where she was pressed against her too soft bed. She'd overslept. Pressure leaned into her wrists, keeping them pinned against the bed. She wasn't aware that she was thrashing until she wasn't anymore. As soon as he saw she was awake, Leander released her. His face was hidden in shadow where he was perched on the edge of the bed.
I came to check on you. You were making noises, he said.
She looked away. She could only guess. Great. I knew it had been too long since I had a nightmare about her. Her teeth gritted. Her heart rate was still unnaturally high. This is exactly what she didn't need right now. More proof of her weaknesses. When he spoke again, his words were too soft.
What happened to you?
Anova stilled. Her throat felt like it had clamped up, and no air could release or enter. She couldn't speak. His black eyes stared into hers too clearly. The Fae boy who wasn't supposed to be alive stared at her until she couldn't help but stare back. His hand found the side of her face.
What happened, Anova?
She tried to open her mouth and speak, but nothing came out. She couldn't haul up this part of her. It would be like bringing a dead body to the surface of a lake. It was too long buried, bloated, and rotted. Too much a part of her now. Her throat dried up. Secrets like buried bodies were how she'd lived this long. When you kept to yourself, the only one who could betray you was you. And the more people you let in, the more they could hurt you. The more invitations you gave them to do so. But there was something throbbing in her chest that begged to do something else. To scream these things. To curse them. To tell not just anybody, but him. When the words finally came, they weren't the ones he was expecting. She could see it on his face. "Will we be convincing enough?" she said. Leander's response was careful. "For?" "You know what I mean," she accused him silently. She clarified anyway. "For our performance." His dark lashes brushed against his skin as he looked down. He leaned over her, and his scent laced the air. With his mouth at her ear, he said,
"You're avoiding my question."
Her pulse raced. Why couldn't he just accept that? Why did he want to know so badly? Her hand went to his face this time, and she traced his lower lip. It was time for him to stop asking questions. "How would you convince them?" she asked. "It's important that they think we're close." Desire smoldered in his eyes, and he shuddered from her circling touch, though he tried to hide it. "Would you run your fingers through my hair and hold my head like this?" As she spoke, she did the same to him. His hand clamped on top of hers. Locking gazes with her, he said, "Yes." The chills from her nightmare were forced from her body, and replacing it with something altogether much warmer. She felt feverish, but she didn't want to stop. And she didn't want to close her eyes again. So, when his mouth pressed against hers, soft but deep, she didn't close her eyes. He was much too beautiful for that, anyway. It was easy. She tilted her head up and up, drinking from him as if he were a fountain and she were dying of thirst. He moved on top of her, and she discovered she couldn't touch enough of him. They moved together, and she felt his heart through his clothes. Her fingers found the buttons on his silk shirt. When she felt the first of his bare skin, his hands closed around hers in a vice grip. He pulled away from her. She narrowed her eyes at him. "What are you doing?" She didn't miss that his chest was beating much faster than she'd ever remember seeing it do so. His raven hair was mussed, but he almost looked more elegant for it. Even so, his voice was even when he spoke. "You should sleep more." He got off her bed. "There are things I can take care of while you rest." She swung herself over the side of the bed and rose. "No, I need to practice. I'll spar against one of the dummies if you're busy." Dizziness hit her, and she fell back against her bed, but when she hit one of her bruises, she let out a low groan. His eyes were hard as he watched her. "We're taking a rest day." She swallowed. She hadn't wanted to come to this. "I don't want to sleep alone, so I won't be sleeping in here even if you lock me inside." It was the pitiful truth. He looked away from her face and into the moonlight streaming into her room. "I have a lounge bed in my study. You can sleep there while I work." Anova breathed. She wasn't sure what to say. He turned to look at her. "Besides," he added with a smirk, "practice wouldn't be fun if I could have you on your ass in 3 seconds. She glared at him. "You'll pay for that," she promised, though she couldn't suppress a snort. After a few more hours. Chapter 33. The phantoms of her dreams passed among visions that she was certain were real. As she dozed, Leander leaned over his desk and a light cast over his face. In her dreams, he came to her, kissed her forehead, and pushed her hair out of her face as he traced her expression. In her other dreams, she sat with Juris as they ate bakery sweets. She asked him if she was doing the right thing. He never answered. Sometime in the night, voices reached her ears. They rose from a hush, strained and too loud for the darkness that surrounded her. She saw the Fae world again, except the atmosphere was different than it was in her dreams. Through heavy lids and shadows, she saw Leander standing over his desk. His face was equal parts fury and sadness? She didn't understand this dream. "Why didn't you tell me it could have been like this?" He snapped at the other shadow she thought Miriam, though she couldn't be sure. She didn't hear their response. Their voices returned to a dull hum in the back of her mind, and she fell back into a deep, dreamless slumber. When she rose to consciousness, it was different yet again. Miriam was above her, his hand on her shoulder from waking her up. His jaw was tight. "What's going on?" Anova shifted upright. She looked for Leander, but he wasn't in his study anymore. Night still pervaded the Wolfsbane manor, and she had no measure of time to say how long she'd been sleeping. Her body felt stiff as she moved, so she guessed more than a couple hours had passed. "The king is here. We saw his approach, but with barely time to prepare. Leander suggested moving you upstairs, however." Anova stopped breathing. "It's too late for that," she guessed. "He wishes to see you," Miriam responded. Anova rose fully. This was too early. They weren't ready. They hadn't even announced. A pit formed on the bottom of her stomach. "Miriam, what's going on here?" Miriam's expression was tight. She remembered Iona's words. "We told no one." Before he could answer, the doors to Leander's study slammed open and Fae poured in. They fanned out from a center, as organized as tiers of petals on a flower. Malor was next on the other side of the king, opposite Leander. The antlered Fae gave her a hateful glare. Leander was speaking.
I assure you, there is no threat on my life here, my lord. Unless you count the studies Nerium insists on assigning to me.
Leander looked every part the bored young heir to his family's estate. He tossed a glare to his manservant for good measure. The High King spoke to Leander. Now that you are part of my court, I would not have threats idly lay claim to your life, even if they are mere hearsay. The High King's eyes danced with some dark emotion when he saw Anova. It made her want to shudder. Anova, what a pleasure. Who threatened Leander? Her blood thundered through her as another thought hit her. Was this to be their opportunity? I don't have my poisoned knife or even... Anova's mouth hung open. The guards had started tearing apart his study. Entire collections of books flew from the shelves. What were they hoping to find? The pleasure is my own, my lord, she said finally. They're going to find the passage to his training grounds if we don't do something soon. Anova tried to catch Leander's eyes, but he wasn't looking her way. It didn't help her nerves. This smells like a setup. But by who? Nerium was stiff beside her. She wished she could ask him what was going on. The darkness from the windows was fading. Day was breaking. Forgive me, my lord, Anova said, her voice strong despite the turbulence inside her. But what threats? I received word that there is an active threat against your master's life. My advisors have confirmed it. When I heard, I insisted on accompanying them to investigate the matter. Anova choked on air, though she tried to cover it up. Could it be real? Someone wanted Leander dead. Who wasn't the king himself? At the same time, she cringed at the word he'd used. Master. One of his guards burst through his study doors, a Fae in shining black armor and a spiked helm. His eyes cut to her, Leander, and Nerium. Whose rooms are the third on the right? Anova swallowed, though she knew she shouldn't have been nervous. She didn't have anything to hide from Nerium and Leander. The king was another matter entirely, but all the damning evidence had been disposed of, or so Nerium had seemed to imply. She saved Leander the trouble of coming up with some outlandish lie like claiming none of them used the room. She was fairly sure she'd even left yesterday's dinner clothes out, a simple blue gown. Mine. He showed something in his gloved hand to the High King, and her stomach twisted into a knot. She knew what it was without waiting for him to announce it. It was her wolfsbane, the poison she'd collected under Leander's nose from his greenhouse. Her mind raced. This had definitely been a setup, and matters were only going to get uglier. Poison. The High King looked her up and down, evaluating her as if he was seeing her in a new light. You're the assassin, he murmured. You were planning to kill him. Her heart felt like it had stopped for several seconds, only for it to try to make it up by beating doubly fast. I planned no such thing, she said through her teeth. A small, strange relief hit her. He may have found me out, but he's wrong about the target at least. Leander would never believe I was keeping that to poison him, even if he didn't know I held it. She could feel their relief as well. Even so, they'd come to the end of this facade. Malor smiled joylessly, exposing his sharp teeth. She's lying. Hear how her heart struggles with the lie. The High King's eyebrows rose. Unless there was another purpose to keeping this poison in your rooms? Of course, she couldn't answer that. This was it. They were at the end of their rope. He'd forced their hand. She looked over at Nerium and Leander. It was time. The three of them had rehearsed this exact scenario. If they faced him and his retinue unharmed and outnumbered, they would attack as one and disarm them for weapons. Even if it was an optimistic plan for a dismal situation, it was a plan nonetheless. And she had a history of doing well in situations where she was supposed to die. Anova started eyeing the one closest to her, a female fae with bronze skin. She would have to be better than her in every way, no matter the cost. Leander was doing well in his role. His glare was palpable.
You and your guards have done me a service in alerting me of this treachery, he said. Trust that I will punish her accordingly.
Her neck itched. She always got like this before a fight. She made eye contact with Leander. Something broke through his mask that he'd constructed for them all. Only for a second. He wasn't going to fight.
I think not. Assassins will not be suffered to live under my reign,
the King of Fae said, moving in her blind spot. She felt his finger on her neck, as if tracing the spot where they'd kill her.
Even as members of my court.
His touch was gone, and she wished she could turn around to face him, but she remained as she was, staring at Leander.
However, the High King continued, I will do you the honor of giving you the choice here, Wolfsbane. I am a guest in your home.
Her blood thundered. She would attack by herself then. She would die fighting before the king put so much as another finger on her.
The choice is yours, the High King repeated.
Out of her peripheral vision, she saw something in Malor's face twitch. He was hungry for blood.
Malor will execute her now, or we will return her to her own people for judgment for her crimes.
In Malor's hands was a curved blade. It was the same kind that his underlings had used in the border forests to behead the Fae lady in front of her infant son. Dim light glinted off it. Blood pounded in her ears hard enough to nearly deafen her. It was about to be used on her. Leander stared straight through her like they were talking about someone not present. His eyes were dull. When he spoke, his voice was as cold as the last branch of leaves in winter.
To answer for what she has done to myself and my house, she will be returned to her own people.